Well, Chris, I think we've had a heck of a 2-day run here, right? We've gone through all kinds of different things for people to do to generate business. And then the oh shit moment is, oh God, I caught the car. Now what do I do?
Yeah.
And the contract is a scary thing. And we're going to do our best today to take the fear out of the contract. And we've got a pretty cool way that you've actually created. So, well, I created too. So I did the intake form, which I'll explain in a minute. That's just this simple. Contracts are easy. You can do it in 8 minutes. And then you did the everything but the blanks, which is kind of cool because the Florida Association of Realtors contract that we use is a compilation of all the crap that's happened in Florida real estate over the 30 years I've been doing this, because it used to be a 2-page contract. And then some lawsuit got settled and they added something to the contract. And then some other thing got figured out and they added to the contract. Then a hurricane hit and they added stuff to the contract. And the contract just grew and grew and grew. And now it's 12 pages or 13 pages. And it just,
13, depending on the contract.
Yeah, just grows and grows and grows, but it covers a lot of stuff. So our goal for you as agents is to master the contract, because the confidence and the competence that you have exudes to the customer and takes away a lot of the, it makes them calm when you're calm, right? So we want to be the calming force in the transaction. So where would you like to start, Mr. Reed?
I'd like to start and just let them know that, it's not your job to know every single line of the contract all the time in every circumstance and every situation. Eventually you'll get to a point close to that, but Craig and I learn new things every day. There's plenty of times that I call him and he's like, oh, wow, I didn't read it that way. Hold on a second, let's look at it. And then the same thing with me. So we're both learning all the time on the same contract that we've been using for, you've been using it for what, like 20 some 30 years. So it's not your job to know everything. Let us help you. So as you go through these things and you go through contracts, that's why pairing yourself with a good partner and brokerage like Beggins Enterprises is going to be real powerful for you because we can help you with that. So what we do want to do is give you the knowledge that you need to write the contract and understand why you're filling certain blanks in a certain way, and giving you circumstantial issues and evidence and things that happen throughout your contract or throughout our practice that are going to put you in a better position. So you can say, okay, well, what's the perfect contract? What would I do in this scenario? So we can complete it the way that it needs to be done to put your buyer in the best position.
And we also don't want you to be bullied by other agents who act like they know what they're talking about, because you're going to see a lot of shenanigans out there with people making up rules that just don't exist. and we want you to pull out your pen and go, no, read this line right here. Right.
Yeah. Well, it's important because the contract says one thing, but I've had people will literally tell me, look, I know this contract and that's not what it says. And we could send them a snippet with a highlight of what it actually says and send it over, and they have their oh crap moment. So no matter how good you are, no matter how much you know, no matter how many contracts you've done, we've all been wrong before. We've all been in a situation where we've had to go back and read it. And that's why it's really powerful to have a partner with you.
Yeah. And be aware of the agent who says, hey, I've been doing real estate for 15 years. I've got agents who've done more transactions in 1 year than an agent who's been in business for 15 years and they know the contract better. So we think they'll just protest too much.
Well, like you said, somebody who starts off, well, I've been doing this for 25 years. Okay, well, there's been a lot of changes to the contract over 25 years. So, or somebody said, well, I've been doing it for this long. Well, the contract, there's new changes coming out starting November 1st to the FAR bar contract. So it changes nearly every single year. You're going to see that. So just because they've been doing it that long, they haven't been doing it this way that long, because it's changed. That part of the contract changed 3 years ago, 4 years ago, or 5 years ago. So everybody can learn a little bit from it.
Okay, so we've got 2.5 hours to go through the simple. Let's make a contract really simple. You can fill it out in your sleep. 2, let's learn the details of what's in there so you're a ninja badass. And then 3, we want to cover on the addendums that are most commonly used, right? And we'll touch on all of them, but we'll cover in detail some of the most beneficial ones that you'll want to use. So if you think we're ready, let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's jump in. We'll start off with what the intake form and the contract.
Yep.
Okay.
So what I've done is, I don't know, is this big enough for you guys to see if I put both up on the monitor at the same time?
I can see it fine.
Okay,
On a
well, I need a
computer
magnifying
monitor.
glass, but I can do it. So this form right here, I'm in a program called Loop, which is our back office management program. And Loop is just amazing. So this is like when you join us, you've got the Next Level Resource Center that goes through your first week. This is one of the platforms we want you to become really familiar with, right? This is, I mean, I haven't bragged about my daughter yet. So Jessica and Samantha too, but Jessica's a real estate agent. Samantha works in the back office. She's vacationing right now. But I was so proud that Jessica's mastered Loop so much. She literally sent the customer into the house. She sat in her car on her phone, wrote the contract. They got in the car and she gave it to them for in-person signing. I mean, that's how proficient you can be with this tool when you learn how to use it. And there's a ton of training available that we've done and that Loop offers. So it's really one of those must-do events. Become very familiar with it. It'll make your life simple. And if you don't, it will frustrate the heck out of you, because I still am not a master at it and it frustrates me. I had to sign something yesterday and somebody had set it up for me and it wouldn't let me sign. It's just those stupid little things drive me crazy, but I go to Elizabeth and she takes care of it for me. So there you go. So this is in Loop. I went to contract terms and I searched for intake. I'm sorry, that's critical date timeline. I meant this one, intake. And the story behind this is pretty simple. So there was a time in the recent past where I've got a saying that if you don't have an assistant, you are the assistant. And the idea was that you would fill out this form. So you have your customers in tow, you stop at Starbucks or something, you sit down, they say they want the house, you whip out this form, you fill in these blanks, and then you give it to your transaction coordinator. And then they have your loop prepared and set up for you. Right. So that was the idea behind this. And it didn't really happen that way, but it became a really cool way to train the contract. Because when you take the 13 pages of the contract here on the left and all the stuff that it has, it's literally overwhelming. There's 618 lines, and every line that has an asterisk by it is something that can be filled out. Right. So it's really got a lot of safeguards in it to make sure you don't get kind of burned, but it's overwhelming to think about 600 lines and a whole bunch of asterisks that you got to do something with. So in our mission to take away the fear, this is all you have to worry about right here. The intake form, this is all you need to know with pen to paper or keyboard to paper. That's all you need to know. So Chris, why don't you take away?
Well, think about it as even more powerful for a new agent, as a newer agent who may not know the terms of the contract, is not comfortable with it, doesn't want to pull out the 13 pages and go through line by line, trying to express to a buyer what it is, what blank do I go to next? Do I find the next asterisk and fill that in there? You don't have to do that. You can have this one form, and this will tell you exactly what you need and exactly what questions you need to ask that buyer as well. It'll be very easy for you, and you're going to see and feel more professional. So, buyer, starting off at the top, some of the most important parts is, do you have the correct buyer or seller name? So we find this all the time. I've done it before where I put a buyer name on a contract and he goes, hey, there's a C in my name. You forgot to put the C in it. It's happened. We've made mistakes before. So, a common practice that I like to use is just asking them at some point, if you don't know the buyer, ask them,
what's your legal name?
send me a copy of your driver's license. Can you do me a favor? Take a picture of your driver's license and send it over to me. Number one, it's a safety thing. If you don't know the buyer and they send that to you, somebody who sends you their license is probably going to be less likely to try and commit some type of breaking of a law if you have their legal documentation. So asking them to send you over a copy of their driver's license, looking up the seller name in the property records to make sure that you have it correct and you get it done correctly. Because we've all made a mistake like that before, but that's a simple thing. And letting them know at that point, I've got this form here while we're sitting down talking. I'm going to need an email address for both of you, both you and your spouse, you and your partner, you and whoever you're buying the home with.
Why do we need that?
Well, because Loop is going to require it. Most all of our transactions are done on technology. We're not really using paper contracts anymore. This paper form right here is probably the only one. And you could literally take this form and do it on your phone and fill it out on your phone if you wanted to while they're sitting there. But I need an email address for both of you because our system does not acknowledge you, John Smith, and you, Jane Smith, using the same email address. It's going to make you have a separate email address.
For
So
electronic signature validation.
Exactly. So if we have we need two separate email addresses, and I need your legal name for both of you. Can you give me a copy of your driver's license, send that over to me, and then a valid phone number? Why? Because your lender, the title company, myself, the brokerage is probably going to need to reach out to you and ask you for some personal and private information. And that's one way that they're going to contact you if you don't feel comfortable sending it in an email and writing over to them.
And I don't want to sound like a jerk, but I'm the broker. It's not your contract, it's my contract. If something, heaven forbid, were to happen to you and we need to reach the customer and they're in your phone and not on a piece of paper, and we can't reach them, that looks really bad, right? So you have to paper the broker's files, right? We're not going to take your customer's information. There's nothing to do with that. But as the broker, Chapter 475, Florida real estate law, it's the broker's contract. So you got to give us this stuff. Yeah, so, and that's not for this form, that's for your deal sheet, but we need the customer's contact information, should be in the loop.
Yep. You're the responsible party. You being the broker are the responsible party for that. And we are relying on you, the agent, to provide us with all the pertinent information for the contract that technically C21 Beggins represents, not necessarily you, the agent.
Right. All right. So we got the name, we got the email address, the phone number. At the top, we kind of skipped this, but it's really important to recognize who's representing who, because it makes a difference. Let's have a little agency discussion first. It's been sprinkled throughout the events here, but the fact that we allow you to represent a buyer or a seller as a single agent is a big deal, right? Saw a lot of chattering going on back and forth. So it's become evident. We did training last week on the Code of Ethics, and the Code of Ethics says that when you are not a transaction broker, you need to disclose your agency relationship to the opposite side at first contact or prior to contract signing. So if I'm a single agent, how would I be a single agent, Chris?
The only way in Florida you become a single agent is by delivering the single agent notice in writing and having it acknowledged by the buyer or the seller.
Right. So a lot of our agents are saying they're single agents, but they don't have the document signed, which means they're not a single agent. And then if you deliver an offer to a listing broker and you don't disclose that you are a single agent, then you're violating the Code of Ethics, because they're relying on the fact that you're a transaction broker, which means they can keep your secret. But if you don't tell them who you are, then they can tell you things that they would not normally have known if they actually understand agency, which most agents don't. So at the top there, recognize, who do I represent? The seller, the buyer. I'm going to use an as-is contract or a regular contract. So today we're going to cover the regular contract, right? Because that's the complicated one. The as-is it's a FR contract for dummies. It just doesn't have anywhere near the stuff. And I'll show you the difference when we get to the critical date timeline. But I'd rather you learn the complicated contract, because the simple one just takes things away. You don't have to deal with it.
Well, and we are seeing more and more people asking for a residential contract with repair limits because it has more teeth and holds a buyer more accountable. With as little inventory as we have and the amount of buyers that are out there, I want to be certain that the buyer that I select is serious about my property, and a residential contract with repair limits, which we'll cover and talk about further into the class, is going to keep the buyer held accountable and not give them that right to just cancel for any reason during their inspection period. So we're seeing a lot more of that, which is why we're going to focus on that, because this is, if you get in a position where you have to write one of these are the things you'll know. The other one is easy. You have two rights: buy the home or cancel the contract. That's it. This one has a lot more to learn, and that's why we're going to cover it.
Yeah, and some deviousness that's happening too is I can have a buyer and I could put contracts on 3 or 4 different houses at the same time. And then within my inspection period, just cancel the other 3 and keep the one I want.
Yep.
Right.
Mike, if you circle or check both seller and buyer, then you're a transactional agent, right? That is correct. It's if you're going to get the single agent notice signed by the buyer, please get all of the brokerage relationship disclosure forms signed. The brokerage relationship forms will state that you're a single agent, but you're going to transition to transaction broker if they want to see a C21 Beggins listing, and that's imperative. Otherwise, you cannot show a Beggins listing, because we can't have dual agency, can't be a single agent for both parties on the transaction. So yes, you would automatically be a transaction broker, but just make sure that you have the proper documentation signed as a buyer.
Yeah.
As a seller, it's built into the listing agreement. You have to do nothing. But as a buyer, sign all 3 of the brokerage relationship disclosure forms, please.
It's single agent with consent to transition to transaction broker.
Yep.
Say that out loud 10 times fast. Good. Okay. So we're representing the buyer. Let's say we're a single agent. So we have the buyer sign single agent with consent to transition to transaction broker. We scan it in or we did it electronically, and then we put it in the loop, right? So the document's always there. It's in the file. We have to keep it in the file, right? So our agency agreement is in the loop. Now we're good. Then what do we need to do? This is fill out the contract, Chris. Property address. Where do we find that?
Public record.
Yeah, or the MLS or public records. And remember,
Well,
you fill this out for your assistant. So you're going to fill out this form, give it to your assistant, which is you, if you don't have an assistant, and then you're going to go play golf. And then your assistant's going to create the loop and make it all ready and send it out for signature. So it's all done. So this is just real quick, down and dirty. Property address, easy to find, city, state, zip, got it. MLS number found on the MLS transaction report.
Hey, real quick, while we're not too far off from the brokerage relationships, the question is, does Florida not recognize designated agency, same brokerage, different agents? It does, but there's certain circumstances that have to prevail. Like I think each person has to have at least $1 million in assets. The purchase price or something has to be a certain amount. There's certain things that have to be present in this situation for there to be a designated agent circumstance. Sorry, I
Where
didn't
did you
want
see that? I don't see that
on
question.
it was on the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yes, and it's typically with commercial deals.
The broker can designate for a residential transaction if it's over $1 million.
Mhm.
I don't know why that's important, but it is the way it is.
Yeah.
All right.
So back to that, we got your most all of that's going to be an MLS, but also if you want to make sure that everything is correct, I like to go to public record and just verify that the city, state, and everything is correct. Like here, you see in a lot of places, zip codes change. So a postal zip code may be like here in our area, one part of a postal zip code says Ruskin, but then part of the mailing zip code says it's Apollo Beach.
Yep.
So different areas sometimes show up a little bit different. So if you want to make sure it's correct, go to the property appraiser, go to the tax record, and you'll make sure you have the most up-to-date from the county, what the property, city, state, zip code, and everything else is.
Perfect. All right. Everything on this form is important, right? It should be done correctly. These are big reminders here. The next 2 items, included and excluded items. Chris, is that a problem?
It's a huge problem, a huge problem. And we run into this all the time. And sometimes it's abundantly clear, but we didn't make it any more abundantly clear by just saying, hey, we want absolute clarity because we know this has been an issue before. So personal property, included and excluded, this comes up more often than you would think. We just had an issue. Well, let's go through this section of the contract first, and we'll talk about what some of the issues that go along with it.
Okay, so the contract says, I'm going to sell you the real and personal property. The real property we've identified with the legal description and the property address. The personal property is unknown, so the contract defines it. And it says personal property, unless excluded in paragraph 1E down here, or by other terms of the contract, the following items which are owned by seller, emphasis on owned by seller. What if I've got a water softener that's leased?
It's not owned.
It's not owned. So what does that mean you should do as a diligent agent?
Call it out.
Yeah. Say, is that water softener owned or is it leased?
Reference in a situation like this, reference your property disclosure as well as a secondary thing. Like you want to call it out, but reference the property disclosure. Is that owned or leased? Well, the seller leases it. Well, I'm reading the property disclosure and it says that there are no leased appliances. Can we have that corrected for absolute clarity for all parties? Can we talk about that?
These are tricky little things. That this is real life. We're not going to just pick on dumb things that don't matter. This is where you go. I want you to be extra diligent on these items.
The next part is really important too, because it says and existing on the property as of date of initial offer. So the day I make the offer, you've got these really nice Hamilton Bay fans and let's just say they're a brushed nickel faucets and handles and everything. And I write you an offer. And before you decide, well, let me change those out and I'll accept the offer. You can't do that. This is, and we've had people do that before. This is no BS. They've done it before. We had some really nice copper finishes that were the bronze faucets and things like that. And the seller changed all of them out in the entire house, sent back the offer, and we went for the inspection and they weren't the same. So these things happen. And that's why it's important to note that it says existing on the property at the date of the initial offer.
Hey, Angelique said intake form is meant for agents with experience. Agents that are brand new to real estate should take the time to learn and write contracts without the intake form. 100%. This has now just become a teaching tool,
Yes.
right? The purpose of this form is to take the fear out. This is all you really need to know. But as you're seeing, as we go through, holy crap, there's a lot more to included items and excluded items than what the form says.
Yes.
Right. So this is a teaching tool. We're going to teach you the scary stuff too. But I want you to see this is really all you need to know. And most of it's relatively easy, especially if we call it out or use this as a reminder to call it out.
Yep. So going further, talking about the items that are included, I mean, you can read, so we don't have to go too far into it, but really note the parenthesis S at the end of all of these items.
Refrigerators.
Yes.
How many refrigerators do you have?
I've got 3 in the house. So we've got one in the kitchen, one in the garage, and then there's a wine refrigerator in the kitchen as well. This says that all of them stay. So if I want to keep
The ones that were there the day I saw the house.
Yep. If I want to keep my $50 garage fridge, I mean, that one doesn't stay. It's a piece of junk anyway. Why would you want it? That doesn't matter. The contract says it stays. So if I want to take it with me, I'm going to have to exclude it, which we'll talk about in a second. So just note the parentheses S is very important because it calls out if there are multiple on the property, and this is your job as a listing agent and a buyer's agent. As a listing agent, before you put the property on the market, call all of these items out, make sure the seller understands that. Sometimes I bring a copy of a contract and leave it with a seller just to point those things out, just so you know. Please note these items are here. Notice it says light fixtures, drapery rods and draperies and blinds. So your curtains, your curtain rods, all of those things are supposed to stay. So as a buyer's agent, please note those items. Those are supposed to stay. And if you want to remove them, you can, but they are supposed to be included.
And what's a good practice on a listing? Tell the seller to take away the stuff they don't want. Just avoid the questions. If you want to keep the drapes and the rods, take them down and either put something else up or leave it down.
And here's what they'll say, but it's not going to look as nice. If it's going to entice the buyer to buy the home, then it's something that should be included, especially if the contract says it's going to be included. If you don't want to take it, best thing is remove it. Go buy a cheaper version of it at Target or Walmart, some new curtains, and throw them up there. It'll be just as fine.
Right. And then other personal property items included in this purchase are.
Well, Mike chatted in freezer and garage not included. Is the freezer is a refrigerator. It refrigerates items. It would be included. If it's
I would go one step further and say, write it in anyway, just so we don't have to argue about it.
Just that's the thing. If it's not clear and you have a question, well, this is not supposed. Okay, does it say freezer anywhere up there? No, technically it's probably a fridge. Should we call it out? Absolutely. We should put it in there. Included freezer and garage, deep freezer and garage. It's a refrigerator.
Yeah, because in this contract, it says handwritten provisions override the pre-printed text. In this contract, in the not highlighted sections, handwritten provisions override pre-printed text. So if you write in freezer and garage not included, that overrides anything else in the contract.
What does it not have in there? A couple things that a couple of them are being added on this next revision. Number one, we talk about this a lot right there. Chuck just put it, brackets for wall TVs have been an issue on deals I wrote. Brackets for wall TVs on the next revision of the contract are going to be added into personal property. So it will state that brackets for TVs, mounts for TVs will stay, but right now it does not. So if you're using this version of the contract before the revision, write it in there as being included if you want it to be clear, because it's not. It is not a part of the contract currently. And if you want it cleared, you have to make it clear.
We're talking about the flat TVs that get mounted on the walls. The TV is personal property, it goes, but the bracket is mounted to the wall. So the argument is the TV attached to the bracket or is the TV not? So we're going to clarify it. But in the meantime, if you're writing an offer, state brackets to wall TV mounts to be included.
Yeah. Also, the other thing that's not in here, like we mentioned, is water softeners. Okay. Well, in my opinion, which it's just my opinion, because my opinion doesn't matter, what's within the four corners of the contract does. In my opinion, a water softener is plumbed into the house. To take it out, you would have to cut the pipes and cap water, like main water supplies that coming into the house, and remove it, which I would say that that is a fixture and should go with the property. But
I
people
agree.
are removing them all the time, and even when they're owned or leased. And if we never call it out, well, that was leased, I didn't own it, and your buyer expected it. Now we have an issue because your buyer expected it and we didn't call it out and do our job. And if you're a single agent, you have a higher duty of representation to that buyer, and you need to go the extra mile for that. Like, these become the little things that make a big difference in the transaction in the end.
These are the little things that cost you commission dollars at closing because you feel bad and then you end up donating cash to solve the problem that shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Well, and we're always going to do what's right too. So as a brokerage, we have a policy of we're going to do what's right. And if it's our fault and we made that mistake and we didn't take the extra steps, we're going to do what we can to try and make it right.
Correct. All right.
So now the line right below that last blank, personal property is included in the purchase price, has no contributory value and shall be left for the buyer. That's basically clarity for a lender. It's saying that, hey, everything that's being left has no contributory value towards the appraisal, towards anything like that. It's part of the sale and we're just going to leave it. But what oftentimes happens is a lender is going to come back and say, I need this personal price. If you include things like a pool table, or include things like a dining room set or a bedroom set, and it's not customary in that neighborhood or in that area or in that section where where things like that are included in a sale, a lender's going to ask you to remove that from the contract. It happens all the time.
Which they shouldn't, because it says that it has no contributory value, but
Correct.
the lender has the gold and they make the rules.
Yeah, so just keep that in mind that happens sometimes. And if that happens, then you just take the next step and you write a bill of sale. Just get a copy of a bill of sale from online and get it to the buyer and the seller and let them agree to whatever they're going to agree to. You can help them if you want, but make any of those agreements between the buyer and the seller.
Yep. And then line 23 has an asterisk by it, so it means you can fill it in. What's excluded? Now this is where, Chris, in the listing agreement, the seller said, look, I'm not taking the chandelier down, but it's not included in the sale. So we put in the listing agreement, which is a contract between the seller and the brokerage, that the chandelier does not convey. But then the purchase and sale contract comes across, and guess what it says? Lighting fixtures convey. So if we don't exclude the chandelier, then we kind of screwed our seller, because the seller says, hey, broker, I don't want the chandelier to go. But the contract says the chandelier is included. So we want to make sure we exclude it there. And your listing agreement has a line for excluded items, which you want to pay attention to. But the listing agreement does not transfer to the purchase and sale contract because it's a different contract. Listing agreement, contract between broker and seller, purchase and sale contract, contract between buyer and seller. Just because the broker's contract says it doesn't mean the buyer's contract does. In fact, they don't.
A couple other items that aren't listed on there: sheds,
Pool equipment.
pool equipment. Mike made a mention of reverse osmosis. It's not listed there. It's plumbed into the property, but it's not listed. If you want it clear, put it on the list as included. Sheds.
Well, let's clarify that again, Chris, because the MLS says reverse osmosis system.
Yep.
But the MLS is a contract between the two brokers. It's not a contract between the buyer and the seller. So if the MLS says it goes, this contract doesn't say whatever the MLS says.
Yeah, and even if we've had it happen where people have put in as per MLS and it still does not hold. It doesn't hold because the MLS is a separate agreement between the brokerages, has nothing to do with the buyer and seller. And you're saying per the MLS. Okay, well, what date was the MLS put in? Did anything change? It's not, was it the same? We can't go and prove that that's what it was on that date. It could have got changed later. If you want it clear, write it on this contract. Same thing with sheds. There's the $300 shed that just sits right on top of gravel, or somebody put some brick pavers down. It sits right on top of it. It's not attached. Can they take it? Should they take it? Should it stay? I don't know. If you want it clear, put it in there. Then they have the other metal building sheds that have a poured foundation. It's attached to the ground. Do you want it to stay? Let's put it on there just for absolute clarity, because you never know what could happen. If I had known this, I would have done that differently. That's a statement you never want to hear. And these are ways that you can avoid hearing that, is by clarifying and calling things out on these lines of the contract.
Mm-hmm. So much for being simple, right? We're only 4 lines into this simple form.
Yeah, I think we talked yesterday and said, whenever we do a contract class, you end up an hour into it and you're only on page 1.5, page 2, because there's so many little things within the first 2 pages that we want to make sure are clear.
Purchase price, pretty simple, self-explanatory, right?
Yep.
How much does the buyer want to offer? We did some work on the strategic pricing analysis yesterday. It's fully fine to do a SPA for the buyer. Hey, buyer, this is what else is available. This is what else is sold. Where would you like to make your decision based on what's sold in the marketplace?
Yep.
So fill in your price. Deposit is a big deal, right? Number one, when we get to deposit, it talks about initial deposit be held in escrow. Either accompanies the offer or is to be made within blank days of the offer. And then the contract goes on to say later on that failure to make a deposit on time is a breach of contract. And the penalty for breach of contract is forfeiture of deposits paid and agreed to be paid. So if the buyer misses it, they breach the contract and they forfeit the deposit. So it's very important to stress this to a buyer. This initial deposit has to be made on time. And if there's an additional deposit, it needs to be done on time. And those are what's called critical dates.
Yep.
Right.
So
and I recommend, what do we recommend for deposits, Chris?
So the initial deposit on an as-is contract, I mean, make it something that's substantial enough to get their attention. Like, look, if you're going to make a 1% deposit, that's okay. That's fine on an as-is contract. Just make sure your additional deposit is very, very substantial. But if you want to pull out all the stops and make a solid deposit, I mean, it's really going to be, if you're making an offer on a $500,000 home, a perfect offer would be all of the money that you have to bring to the closing table to be in escrow at the time of the offer. That's a perfect offer. So as close as you can get to that is going to be what we would say to put in an escrow deposit. But we know a lot of our buyers are a little uneasy with putting that kind of money out there. So let's say a 1 or 2% deposit up front. I will prove to me the home is in a good condition during the inspection period, and I'm going to give you at least 1 or 2% up front. Once you prove to me the home is in good condition, I'm going to prove to you that my financing is in good condition. I'm going to close, and I'm going to give you an additional deposit of the rest of the money that I'm going to have to bring to closing. So it's a good practice to show that you're serious. And if you want to, yeah, absolutely, Mike, 8%, 8 to 10% is a strong deposit. But let's say your buyer is only bringing 3% to the table because they have a 97% finance loan. So let's put in 1 or 2% and bring the additional money, everything they'll have to bring as a down payment and closing cost as an additional one. Buyers just get a little uneasy, but we can get them attached to the home by getting through the inspection period and showing that everything is good. And then they prove that they're ready to go by putting an additional in.
And I think as a listing agent, you should demand an additional deposit just to make your seller feel more comfortable once their inspections are over.
So another thing, so I've heard people say, well, it's how do we accompany a deposit? How do we do that? Well, 2 clear differentiating factors. This section is only for the section just below this, where you would deliver the escrow, is just for the escrow agent. It's not necessarily the closing agent. The escrow agent and the title agent can be 2 different people. So if you really wanted to make all of your offers really solid, you can deposit $20,000 into Paramount Title, and you can check a company's offer with every single offer that you make and write in escrow agent information, Paramount Title. And you can send them copy receipt of escrow that you have there, a verification of escrow that they're holding $20,000 and a copy of the check, and send it over with every single offer. And you say, look, we already got 20 grand. It's already sitting in escrow. You pick the title company or pick to Paramount. It doesn't matter. We're ready to go. I've already proved to you I'm serious. The money's sitting there waiting. I'm just waiting for the right home. Prove to me your home is good, and I'll even give you more money after that once you prove it.
And shameless plug for Paramount Title, which we own, is you can go online and make your deposit. It's really quick. It's really simple. It costs $8. Much better than writing a check and delivering a check and all the other stuff we got to do. We have 40 offices around the state, but it's just really easy to go put in your account number, routing number, and your deposit's made. Pretty slick.
Yep.
All right. So escrow agent.
Yep. Now, a good practice for escrow agent is to check the listing. If the listing agent at the bottom, they have a section they put in a couple months ago, like 6 months ago, that has their preferred title company. Just make the preferred title company the escrow agent as well. It makes it easier. Because Paramount Title will do it, but if they're holding money that they're not going to make any money on, all they're going to have to do is account for those funds for the next 30 days, balance their checking account at the end of that 30 days, and then eventually just transfer it over to another title company. We're making them work for money they're not going to earn. So the easy practice is to just make the escrow agent on the first page the same as the title agent if the seller has a preferred agent.
And there's really no risk of losing the deposit. The escrow
No.
agent is a third party company. It doesn't matter if they're doing the title or not.
Yeah.
So don't let that be a hiccup for you.
Question online. So Beggins does not hold escrow. No, sir.
We used to, and it was horrible.
Yeah.
Reconciling accounts every month and then doing escrow order disputes. Oh,
It's a PIA.
PITA. Pain in the.
So the next section, once you fill out the escrow agent, is the additional deposit. We're definitely recommending this as a buyer's agent. As a buyer's agent, you want to be offering additional deposits to make your offer stand out. And as a listing agent, you want to be asking for additional deposits to make sure that you've got a solid buyer who's really attached to this property and ready, willing, and able to do what it takes. And a good practice is to see how close you can get to the amount of money they have to bring to closing. Get all of that in escrow. If they got to
Not
bring
doing any
20
good in their
grand,
checking account. If they have it, might as well put it up. Sounds
they're
good.
going to have to bring it to closing in another 21 days anyway. So why not get it in there?
Hey, Chris, I know this doesn't happen often, but what if we had multiple offers on a house? And you were given two offers, and one was 300,000 with $1,000 deposit closing in 30 days. And the other was 300,000 with a $10,000 initial deposit with another $20,000 due at the end of the inspection period. Which one would you be more likely to take?
The one who's willing to put more money for two reasons. The buyer is a solid buyer, or at least they're trying to prove to me that they are. And the agent is probably a better agent because they've advised their buyer to do something that's putting them in a better position and making the seller feel more comfortable.
I looked at a multiple offer sheet that an agent did not too long ago, had 25 offers on it. How many offers had additional deposits on them of the 25? Do you remember?
It was only like one or two.
There's three.
Yeah.
Three out of 25 offers, only 3 agents included an additional deposit. And one of those was the winner.
Yep.
I mean,
If
it's
you
just
wanna
so
stand
simple.
out.
And you
wanna
don't
stand
know
out.
if you're in a competing offer situation or not.
Yep. A couple questions. What about 100% down 100% finance VA loans? So a VA loan, the buyer still has to pay closing costs, and also part of the closing costs, they have a VA funding fee, which sometimes can get rolled in, but typically you're looking at 3 or 4% for closing costs. But even if the buyer puts the money into escrow, if they don't use it for the closing costs or their down payment, they'll get a check cut back to them. So you can still offer any amount of money that you want with a 100% VA loan. And at closing, if I put 20 grand up and I only need 8,000 of it, Paramount or the title company will cut me a $12,000 check at closing.
No doubt. And that's a smart thing to do. Because once again, I've got 2 VA offers. One has $1,000 down, one has $20,000 down. Which one looks stronger?
Exactly. The 20,000.
All appearances, guys.
And then Mike, if we can't find a home, then will Paramount Title return their deposit? Absolutely. The deposit was delivered without any confines of a contract. So the seller doesn't have to release anything. The buyer doesn't have to release anything because you don't have a signed contract. You just delivered an escrow deposit to them unilaterally from the buyer side. So the buyer unilaterally can request it back.
But once this contract is done, the escrow agent is a neutral party and they cannot release it without authorization from all parties.
Correct.
And they will not. And that's where escrow disputes come in, which we'll talk about later.
Correct.
Okay,
So
so
additional deposit, time frame for additional deposit. We like to pair this with your inspection period.
1 day after. So inspection period's 8 days. On day 9, you get an extra deposit. 7-day inspection, day 8. 10-day inspection, day 11.
And like I've mentioned already, the point of that is saying, look, Mr. Seller, prove to me your home is good. And then I'm going to prove to you that I'm a solid buyer with strong financing and more money. I'm just going to give everybody the warm and fuzzies.
Chris, does my chat show on the screen?
I don't see any.
Is the
chat.
contract hindered by the chat box?
Oh, no, I
Okay.
can't see. You can put anything in there. You're good.
Okay. Escrow company name, title company. Escrow company and title company are two different things, can be two different things. We'd prefer it not to be. Please don't make Paramount the escrow agent and not the title company. We'd like to do both or neither. And it's just for ease. Date and time for acceptance. What line is that on? Oh, it is a line. Never mind. I was thinking of something else. Is this important, Chris?
Very important. This happens all the time where somebody's not diligent and not paying attention to their timelines. So that the date and time for acceptance, it says very, very clearly, if not signed and executed and delivered by this date, this offer shall be deemed withdrawn and the deposit returned to the buyer. So that date is really, really important. If it's not filled in, or if that date expires, your offer is deemed withdrawn and your buyer does not have to move forward with it. We're just dealing with one today, this morning. Time for acceptance was Monday. The seller sent it back on Tuesday. And they're saying, okay, well, just sign this and we'll be good. Okay, you can sign it and you'll be good if the buyer would like to move forward with it. But technically, the offer was deemed withdrawn. And if the buyer doesn't want to have to move forward, they don't have to, because there's no obligation to. So, and it may look like the offer's been executed, because if there was no changes that needed to be made and the seller wanted to accept their offer, the offer was deemed withdrawn on Monday and they sent it back on Tuesday. Well, it says signed and delivered. So it could look like it's an executed offer because the seller signed it on the date that it was supposed to be accepted by, but it wasn't delivered to the parties till the next day. So technically, if your buyer wanted to, they did not have to move forward with that offer because it was deemed withdrawn and it was not delivered back to me within that timeline.
Which is really cool about electronic signatures in .loop, because you just share it right away. Sign it,
Yep.
share it, and it comes out right across.
Yep. What if it's in a multiple offer situation and a seller agent has asked for a few more days? Well,
Then you go back and edit it.
He who has the gold makes the rules. If the seller wants a few more days and your buyer really wants the property, a good practice would be to give them the time frame that they're asking for. If your buyer is saying, look, I don't care what they say, I want an answer by this time, full well knowing that the seller holds the gold, they make the rules, and if they don't want to, they don't have to, and they could, it is what it is. But if you want to have the best opportunity, let's go by the terms that they're asking for.
A better practice is to build a relationship with a listing agent, say, hey, how much time does your seller need? Because remember, we used to teach that the right thing to do is to call the listing agent, say, hey, when does your seller get home? I want an answer by today at 5. Right? The sooner you get an answer, the sooner you know. If you give the listing agent too much time, they can go shop your offer against everybody else. So in the market before this market, we said, don't give the listing agent any time. You're the buyer, you're in control, make your offer and it expires if they don't answer it right away. Well, now with multiple offers coming through, if you make your offer expire at 5 o'clock today, the seller's just not going to reply because he's got 3 more offers coming in tomorrow. So there's a strategy here, depending on the market that you're in. We're still in a hot market. I would be diligently being kind to the listing agent.
Pay attention to realtor remarks, reach out to the listing agent, build rapport, build connection, ask them what they're looking for. Are there any other dates and timeframes that are important to the seller that I can include in the contract that we send over?
Yes. Time for acceptance, closing date, big deal, because you don't want to extend your closing date. So how do you figure the closing date out?
You do your job and talk to the lender.
There you go. God, there's a lot of work in this job.
So this is important. So I hear this a lot and it gets very, very frustrating sometimes. Well, okay, I asked them, so has your lender verified that your buyer can close in 30 days? Did you ask the lender? Well, no, I haven't asked them yet. Okay, well, you need to verify that. Well, if we need more time, we'll just ask them for more time. Look, that date that you're saying you're going to close by, you are obligating your buyer to a legally binding contract that says they will close by that date on that time. And then your buyer is obligating the lender to do that. And if the lender can't do that, you have to ask the seller for an extension to a legally binding agreement. And in this market where they probably have a backup offer or 2 or 3, sometimes even more that came in afterwards, they don't have to extend your offer. And if they don't want to extend your offer because somebody's giving them 10 grand more and it's worth it for them to wait 30 more days to close for $10,000 more, they will do that. So don't be so flippant with a closing date that we'll just ask for an extension. That's not the way to handle this. Talk to the lender. How long do you need to close? When would be a good timeline that I can put on here for a closing date? And I'd love to pair the loan approval period that we'll get to in a second with that closing date. So we have 5 to 10 days in between.
Yep. Mom said, if the signed offer is not received in the time, it might be good to call or email the other agent to let them know their offer is withdrawn. Yeah, communication is the key to everything, right?
Well, notice it says delivered, not received.
That's true.
So if you didn't, so I know what Vicky was saying was about receiving the offer, like, hey, I didn't get it, it never came. But what if you just didn't see it? It came, but you didn't see it and you missed it. If they delivered it and you just missed it in your email, just because it wasn't received by you, if it's in your email and we can prove delivery and you see that, technically that's what the effective date is. So if for some reason you say you're out of town or you had an emergency and you didn't pay attention to email for a day and you check it the day after, your effective date is still the date it was delivered because it says on your email, there's a time stamp and date that says it was delivered.
Lauren said, yes, speaking with the lender is crucial, as is lining up an inspector ahead of time to have the quickest inspection turnaround. That alone has won me offers.
Yep.
Yeah, yes, we're a 10-day inspection period and there's 3 offers on the house. And one guy says, I'll do it in 3. I want to know if your house is sold or not quickly.
Yep.
Okay, what else do we need? Title company, time for acceptance, closing date. Is the property presently leased? This question comes up a lot. You got to know if it's leased because the question is, does the lease go with the property? And the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm buying a house that has a lease on it, I've got to honor that lease. And the contract's going to go on to say that I've got to be given a copy of the lease and all this other stuff, but we need to know. And then when is that lease date up? Now, is a lease a hindrance to the sale of a property?
Can be.
Can be. It could be a good thing for a property. If I was going to buy a rental property and there's already a tenant in it, and I'm happy with the terms of their lease, hell yeah, I'll take that one.
What do most loans, most of them, the majority of them are being given for primary residence purposes. And most of them are contingent on the buyer closing and making it their primary residence and occupying the property within like 60 days typically. And if you have a lease that goes past that, you might be acting outside of the terms of the loan that you're getting, and there might be an issue there.
Yep.
Because you're supposed to, on like an FHA, VA loan, or even just a regular conventional loan, you're buying it as it's a primary residence. You're supposed to move in and occupy within 60 days. And if you can't because there's a lease, now it's an investment loan. That's a greater risk for a lender. They could have an issue with that. And that could create a big problem for you with the buyer after you bought that home. Yep. And they find out. And your insurance may not cover any of that either, because now it's an investment property and you bought insurance as a primary residence. So there's a lot of things that go along with that you have to know if there's a current lease in place and when it ends.
Correct. Financing type. It's a fill in the blank issue. So we got to tell our assistant what to do. Is it conventional, FHA, VA, fixed or adjustable, cash? Just fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
Home warranty, yes or no? By whom? Company, and which plan, and how much does it cost? We talked about home warranties a little bit yesterday. Highly recommended. For $775 or $755, whatever Lauren said yesterday, that's the Mac Daddy plan. Mm-hmm. If you want to ask your seller, the seller, to buy a warranty for the buyer, here's what we usually say. If they're not offering a warranty, ask the seller to provide one in your offer. If you are the seller, offer to provide a home warranty to make your buyer more comfortable. In this market, it's become that if you ask the seller for a home warranty and everybody else in the multiple offer situation did not, you're putting your buyer at a disadvantage. But still ask your buyer if they would like to purchase a home warranty. Just because the seller doesn't provide it doesn't mean the buyer can't get it. So let us know. So who's going to do it? Yes, we want a home warranty, because the back office will order the home warranty for you, send you all the stuff and get you ready to go so you can deliver it to the title company. If you don't click this information, then nobody knows to order it for you. You show up at closing and it's not ready. So you got to communicate these things, and the contract will do it, and your deal sheet will do it, which we'll talk about in a little bit too.
This, if you're using this form too with a buyer, it's just another opportunity and reminder. Oh, Mr. Buyer, did you want to ask for a home warranty or buy one? By the way, you're also one of the contractual forms I'm going to send you, or one of the forms I'm going to send you is for my office that's telling you that you have the ability to buy a warranty. So even if the seller doesn't make it part of this contract, you have the ability to buy a warranty. Or if the seller gives you a warranty and you think you want more coverage, you can add on coverage on top of that. So you got a good talking point here. Again, it's just to make sure that they fully understand what their options are and what their rights are too.
Lauren said I had a deal go sideways because the seller and the broker did not disclose a lease. Damn right.
Yep.
Cool. Repair limits. This is important. For the section here, the contract says 1.5% if left blank. 1.5% is a lot of money.
Yeah.
You know, on a $500,000 house, that's $7,500. And there's 3 conditions: wood destroying organisms, mechanical items, and permits. So that's potentially $21,500. It's a lot of cash to obligate a seller to pay. So we usually put numbers in like $500, $1,000, 0.5%, something lower than that. So just all you got to know is you got to know what percentage you want to ask for as repair limits for the general inspections, the wood destroying organisms, and the permits. And then inspection period days. How long do you want? Lauren recommended getting your home inspector lined up before the offer's made to make sure they're on schedule. Everybody's busy now, guys. Everybody's busy. So that's a good practice, but you really don't want this to be as long as possible. I mean, as short as possible.
How long do you need for an inspection?
No more than 3 to 5 days, in my opinion.
How many inspection companies are out there?
Thousands.
Right. So we have a lot of good connections. You can call all of them as you're writing an offer and figure out, hey, do you have anything available in the next 5 days? Yes, we do. Great. I'm going to put a 5-day inspection period on here. Coordinate all that up front. It makes sense to do it.
Yep. Transaction fee. Who's going to pay that? What is that?
Our client, whichever it is, buyer and or seller, will pay a $325 transaction fee. But the only way that we can obligate our buyer to pay that $325 transaction fee and actually make them pay it is by putting it on the contract. If it's not on the contract, technically they didn't agree to it, and it's tough to force them to pay that. Some title companies will refuse to put it on there if it wasn't disclosed on the contract that the buyer is paying a $325 transaction fee. Most of them will. So it's important to have it on your contract, put it in additional terms that they buyer only transaction fee, writing a contract for your buyer. Our listing agreement has it written in $325 plus the listing side commission. So that's covered. You don't have to add it on a contract when you represent a seller. We just have to make sure it's there if you represent the buyer, because that's the only way we can absolutely guarantee and obligate the buyer to pay that.
And that's a drop down button in .loop under clauses. You just additional terms, insert clause, transaction fee. We'll get to that point. And then any addenda you want to include. So that's all you really need to know. 13 pages condensed down to what? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 lines.
So if you're just filling in a contract and you just need to speak with the buyer, hey, I'm going to go get a contract, or I'm going to go write a contract for this buyer who wants to buy something. Let's say you're a newer agent. This is a good tool to use to make sure that you can gather this information, because when you come to us and ask us to help you with that, these are the questions we're going to ask you. Well, how long does the lender need to close? Well, how much does the buyer want to give in an initial deposit? Was there any personal property in the property that we need to include? Did we look at the MLS? We're going to ask you all of these questions. So a good practice to have is to use this form so you know what it is. You should just get in the habit of filling this thing out for most of your contracts if you're new, so that you start getting in the habit of finding all these blanks and then coordinating them into the contract. And then that'll allow us to help you better in the moment, rather than having to keep going back and forth and gathering all this information.
Right. So, Chris, should we go to critical date timeline? You want to cover everything but the blanks first? Because I think the timeline's going to cover a lot of the blanks.
Let's do the critical date timeline, because while we're talking about blanks, that'll get us into reasonings for timelines, and then we can go to some of the blanks or some of the but the blanks and expand on those.
I love the story. So I did a large transaction many years ago, and there was like 7 different owners, and they all had attorneys. and 7 different contracts. And one attorney in particular wrote me a letter and said, "Dear Mr. Beggins, pursuant to our understanding, please acknowledge your consent with the following. The initial deposit is due on this date. Your closing date is here. Your first extension is this. Please acknowledge all these things. These are all critical dates." And I thought it was a great practice. And I went through our contract, and these are all the critical dates that have to happen, or your buyer's in jeopardy, or the seller can take remedy. And these are all the obligations that the parties are signing on to when they sign the contract. It's a great way to communicate the obligations and rights of both parties. I recommend that our agents do this, and our agents do this. They do this and they share it with the listing agent, they share it with the buyer, and they share it with the seller. Because once we have a contract, we're all working in the same direction. We're adversaries until we get the contract, but once the contract's done, we're working together to a successful closing. So all these things have to be done. So let's not hide in the grass and wait for somebody to screw up. Let's move forward to closing.
Yep. Real quick, just to cover a couple of chats before we go further. Okay. I'm in contract with a buyer right now that asked for a 0-day inspection period. Is this a good practice? If it's your buyer, they better be very serious about the property, because a 0-day inspection period means they have no due diligence period, and they're accepting the property in its current condition as is with no questions whatsoever. And when they buy the home, they're accepting all the problems of it as well. So
I think it's one of the stupidest thing a buyer could ever do.
If you have a buyer that does this with a 0-day, if you have a buyer that says, "I'll waive the inspection, I don't need it, I've already seen enough," we have another form in .loop that I want you to have them sign. It's a home inspection disclosure. And the home inspection disclosure says, here's all the reasons I should get a home inspection, and check a box, I'm going to get one, or I refuse to get one, I'm not going to get one. It's just a clarity thing that says, I told you and you said no, remember? So that way it doesn't come back to us and we just have a 0 on our contract for inspection period. The home inspection disclosure is one that's going to really help to cover us if the buyer is saying, no, I don't want an inspection period.
Correct. All right, so your contract is written, it's been accepted by all parties. You go home, have a glass of wine, fill out the critical date timeline, and it's really simple to do. I mean, we made it like bulletproof easy. Seller name, buyer name, property address, listing office, selling office, title company, mortgage company, and who the contact person is. Just good information to have. Remember, you're going to share this with the buyer and the seller and the other agent, so it's a good document. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 critical dates. And we already talked about a lot of these, but we're going to do more detail on them now. Your effective date. What line is that on, Chris?
That's on the very first page, all the way down. Well, why don't we don't have a line? Oh, there's no exact line number for the effective day. Oh, you got me, you sneaky. There's no line for it. This isn't, we go to this line and check, it says this date, that's when the effective date is. I know some of you have done business in other states, some of them have an actual box.
This contract used to have an effective date box.
Yep. And you would write it in, but this one does not. So this is not abundantly clear. So what I would love for all of you to do, if you are on the buyer or the seller side, whenever you get a contract that's been accepted and the last person delivers the effective contract and say, now it's effective. If they did not do it when they sent you the executed contract, you reply, thank you so much. Please confirm the effective date of, for critical date purposes, and put the date in there. And that way everybody's on the same page. Everybody knows exactly what we're working on, exactly what timelines we're going to be working from and what that date is. And we all agree. Then you can do your critical date timeline and send it back to them in an hour or so and say, hey, based on the effective date, here's all the critical dates. But like we talked about earlier, it's not necessarily the date that the last person signed, because the effective date verbiage says signed and delivered to all parties. So if your seller signs it at 11:55 and you don't see it till 8 o'clock the next morning, and then that's when you deliver it, that's your effective date. The other party had no idea the seller signed at 11:55 the night before. So just because it says on there 9/18 was the was when they signed, it wasn't delivered till 9/19, and that's when our effective date is.
Just notice at the bottom of the contract, it says revised 6/19. That's June of 2019. That's when this contract came out. Check this date, because you will find contracts that you'll see FAR bar 4s and FAR bar 3s, FAR bar 5s. This is FAR bar 5X. It came out in June of 2019. Right? So you want to use the most current contract because it's the most current.
And I like to get the effective date absolutely correct from the very first communication of the executed contract, because that's what every other date is going to be predicated on. And I want to get those dates onto this critical date timeline and put into my Google Calendar, so I get reminders as they come due the day before. So it's really important to let's just call it out right from the get-go.
Right. So the way to find the effective date is dot loop will date stamp and timestamp every signature. So the date upon which the last party signed is a good place to go, and you can presume it was delivered on that date. But when you send this document out and the seller says, hey, wait a minute, I don't think the effective date's today. I think it's yesterday. Well, let's discuss that now. Doesn't really matter, but let's agree on it, because everything gets triggered from the expected date, effective date. So going down, the deposit due is on line 27 of the contract. So here's line 27 of the contract. Initial deposit to be held in escrow in the amount of check subject to collection. The initial deposit made, and this line 27 is that. So it tells you what line to look at to get when your deposit is due. So that's a critical date. Line 52 is the closing date. What's our closing date? And Chris, you said it right. Put this in your Google Calendar with a time reminder for 2 or 3 days before the event. Ping, hey, Chris, remember closing stuff up for this property. Ping, hey, Chris, the additional deposit's due. Hey, ping, hey, Chris, it'll remind you. What a great way to be a diligent agent.
Well, also to be a diligent agent too, let's talk about closing date for a minute. If you have a closing date, if you use dot loop, which we all should be doing, you just click on the little calendar button there and it pulls up a calendar. And from today's date, tomorrow's date, you can start counting out days to make sure that you don't put a date on there that's on a weekend. How silly does it really look that you put a closing date for a Saturday or a Sunday? Well, it's not a huge problem because the contract covers it and says that anything that falls on a weekend or holiday will automatically push to the next business day by 5 p.m. But it's just to be diligent. Let's make sure we click on that calendar, find a closing date that's going to be preferably not the last Friday of the last week of the last day of the month. And putting a lot of stress on everybody. So closing dates would be good to pull that calendar up, count out 30 days, 31, 32, make sure the lender agrees to being able to close within that time frame. But let's make sure it's on a date we can actually close.
Yep. Oh, my favorite. Loan application due date is on line 93. You can find that pretty simple when you go to line 93. Application date should be here 5 days from the effective date. So if that's why you have to know when the effective date is, you can add 5 days to it. But this one, loan approval due, we're going to spend some time on this one, Chris. This is my favorite part of the contract that everybody needs to understand super, super well.
Yeah, and this isn't just one date. This is going to pair with closing dates and such, because we want to make sure that on either side, whether it's a seller or a buyer, we want to make sure we're diligent with this timeline. So we're talking about if left blank, it's 30 days, right? So
which is dangerous.
Very.
Because I'm going to give you a rule of thumb. Your loan approval date should be at least 5 or 10 days before the closing date. If not, you're giving your buyer the right to cancel right up until the day of closing, which is unfair for the seller. Seller has to pack and move out of the house before closing. And then the day of closing, the buyer says, sorry, I can't get a loan. I'm canceling. Give me my money back. You got a pissed off seller.
So
right?
as a listing agent, that's a very, very, very important practice to start paying attention to. You should never, as a listing agent, allow a closing date and a loan approval date to coincide together, or a loan approval date that exceeds the closing date. 5 days prior to the closing minimum is a really good practice.
I hope they change that in this contract. They should actually make it 5 days, if left blank, 5 days prior to closing.
Yeah, I mean, so at least 5 days, but 10 days is good. So, hey, look, Mr. Buyer, as a listing agent, Mr. Buyer, I don't care when you close. I'm just telling you that I can't have your loan approval date go right up to the closing date, because that means you can go right to the closing date. Like Craig said, come to me and say, sorry, I got denied my loan, and you have full protection there. I'm going to start packing and moving everything out. And I want to know with certainty that your loan is approved. So if I have 5 days prior, I can have my truck scheduled for the next couple of days, or I can already have that on the calendar. If it's 10 days before, that makes me feel even more comfortable. So
And if you do not close, then I'm going to keep your deposit.
Yep.
That's
I'm
what
going
that
to keep
clause
your
says.
deposit because I'm going to be damaged because I have to change moving dates. I'm not going to be able to, I may be having to pay for two properties now because I may have already moved into another one and I needed this timeline to make sure of that. I might be doing that already, but I need to be able to get my property back on the market and show it and be made whole, because I'm going to be paying for this for another month or 2 months at least, plus the other property I may already have. But as a buyer's agent, if you want to be diligent as a single agent, you can put the 30-day loan approval and 30-day closing. But if you have a diligent agent on the other side, what are they going to say? If you send it over to some of our agents, they're going to send it back and say, well, I've made a few adjustments, or would your buyer be willing to make the following changes? We cannot have a loan approval date that goes right up to the closing date. Either or, if you have a 30-day closing, your loan approval is 25 days, or we're going to push back the closing date to 35 days. Either one, move the closing date or move the loan approval date. Either one is fine. I'm okay with either. Let's close in 35 days, you get your 30-day loan approval. Or let's close in 30 days, you get 25-day loan approval. You pick. I'm okay with either one.
And here's another big problem. See, the previous versions of the contract, they move together. This contract, they don't move together. So when you extend a closing date, your loan approval date stays the same.
Yep.
And the loan approval date is the date at which the buyer says, hey, seller, I've got my financing. I'm basically removing my financing contingency. So if I don't close, you keep my deposit. That's a happy day. But if you move the closing date out and you don't move the loan approval date out, you might not have your loan approval in time. And then your buyer has to make a decision, because if they don't cancel or remove their contingency on the loan approval date, then the seller can cancel the contract on the buyer, which is really important. That's more advanced stuff than we'll probably get into today. But if I got multiple offers and I've got some that are higher and you don't give me a loan approval on the date that I want it, I'll cancel your butt in a second to make the extra 10 grand. Right?
Yep.
And that's happening in this market with agents who know what's going on.
Yep. Mike asked, what about an investment property buyer? I don't think your loan approval date's really going to be any different for an investment property buyer. You're still going to want to show that you're serious, that you have a loan approval, and that there's a little bit of time in between the two. It's basically just proving to the seller that, look, I understand the terms of the contract. I'm not going to put you in a position where you have to move out that very last day. But it's just a date. If you want to be diligent, let's pair the two together with at least a 5-day gap. That's going to show that you're at least being aware of the situation that could be presented.
Mm-hmm.
Inspection period ends line 261.
Here we go. So that is, we talked about that already. So line 261, way down here. Right here. Inspection period. Buyer shall have blank days if left blank, 15 days if left blank. Way too long. Chris, what's our thought on blanks?
Fill them all in. Don't leave anything blank. If nothing needs to go into blank because it's something that it's not pertinent, write NA in it. We would never want something to come back and like, wait a minute, I didn't fill that in. Did they fill that in? When did that go in? Fill in the blanks. Every blank that's there, even if you're using the if left blank term, write it in. Let's just make it clear, absolutely abundantly clear.
It's just sloppy. It really is. A judge would look, if they ever got to court, a judge would say, what is this? What inexperienced person wrote this contract? Leave it blank.
So your inspection period with an as-is contract and with a residential contract with repair limits is similar, but it's kind of different. An as-is contract says, by this date, this timeline, buyer shall have this many days to determine in their sole discretion if they're buying the home or canceling. That's it. With this residential contract, it says buyer shall have this many days after the effective date to perform these inspections. and notify the seller of the issues and defects that this contract says would have to be fixed. And then after that, there's timelines that will come into play. But they're the same, but just a little bit different. So the buyer has to cancel, or they're buying the home with an as is. This, they have to perform and notify the seller of the issues that are there that would have to be fixed, that are covered by this contract.
Gotcha. Additional deposit due, line 36 at the top. So see how simple it is to do? And see how being clear and communicating this to all parties will help you get a closing rather than confusion. It's a really simple thing to do. All right.
Calling them out to your buyer and to your sellers really makes it very clear. Sending them a copy of this. Please see the attached form for all critical dates, or send them the document and just put the main ones into the body of your email. See the attached document for further, further information on these dates.
All right, so that's it. Those are the critical dates. But what else? There's obligations for both parties. And once again, we're going over the regular contract, not the as-is contract. So this has a lot more obligations. I'll show you the as-is one later because it's just shorter. Okay, so what do I mean by obligations? We just put an agent obligation at the top. Contract sent to title company and submit for review in .loop. Just a reminder, you wrote the offer. It's accepted. It doesn't sit in your trunk. Doesn't sit in your loop. You need to submit it for review so back office knows we have a contract, and then we put your name on the hot sheet and you get all excited and happy. And you send it to the title company so they can start tracking their orders, because they got to fit this into their schedule and make sure everything gets done on their end on time. So just a reminder to you, when the contract's signed, it's in your loop, great. But if you don't submit it for review, we don't know about it and we don't do our things. And if you don't send it to the title company, they don't know about it and they don't do their things. So that's just a note to remind you.
Just a good reminder too, signing a contract creates rights and obligations for all parties, buyers and sellers. Your buyer has rights and obligations to perform. The seller has rights and obligations to perform. This is calling each of those out. It's letting them know that it's just a reminder to not be so just lackadaisical about a contract. This is a legally binding contract with rights and obligations, and we have to do these specific things or make sure they're done.
And it's got a lot of language terms in there that say just because you don't do it doesn't validate the contract or invalidate the contract, but it still says it should be done. Like line 159, the seller has an obligation to deliver their existing title policy to the buyer within 5 days of the effective date, if available. Stupid line, right? Never does that happen. It should, because the buyer gets the seller's title policy, they can give it to their title agent and maybe get a discount, but the contract says it. It's an obligation to the seller. Give a copy of your title commitment to the buyer at least 15 days prior to closing. Right?
Well, this is 5 days from the effective date.
Wait, I'm sorry, 5 days of the effective date. So yeah, so you sign the contract today, within 5 days, you got to give it to them. And that's line 163. And then deliver the title commitment to the buyer. This is a fun one. This is where ninja knowledge comes in. If you deliver the title commitment, the seller has an obligation to give the title commitment to the buyer 15 days if paragraph 8A is checked. And what else does it say in that contract, in that line? Failure to do so gives the buyer right to ask for an extension. Is that the one? Yeah.
Yep. If it's not done, the buyer has 5 days to review. So the contract goes on and says that if you have to deliver to them by this date. Once you deliver it to them 15 days prior to, the buyer has 5 days to review the title commitment that's been provided to make sure they're okay with it. Give it to their attorney, give it to the lender, whatever they need to do. But if you don't deliver it 15 days prior to closing, as time goes by, the day the buyer receives it, they still have 5 days to review it. So if the closing date comes and you finally deliver a title commitment to the buyer, technically the buyer has 5 days to review it and can force an extension because the contract says so.
Most people don't know that, but that's what it says. And we pulled that card a couple times.
Yeah, Paramount delivers that to the buyer, correct? Typically, your title company will deliver that to all parties. They will send an email to the seller and the agent, and then the buyer and the buyer's agent.
I'm not sure I agree with that. Most title companies don't. Paramount does, because I told them, I need you to do this every single time.
The majority of them,
Calendar.
again, they're getting better at it because
they?
they've had too many issues with it. Like exactly what you're saying. This is something we used to be able to call out all the time and basically get a free 5-day extension or a free out for a buyer. They're getting better at it because it became an issue because of diligent agents calling it out.
I like it. Okay. Deliver existing survey to buyer within 5 days of effective date. This is an obligation of the seller if they have one. So if you're a listing agent and you're on the listing presentation, and you get the listing, what might you want to collect at time of
Title
listing?
policy, survey.
Title policy survey, put it in your nice little brag book with your pre-inspection and all the stuff you're going to do to market the house. I got the screen is so small in front of me.
Plus, it gives the seller a discount if they have a title policy within the previous 3 years. So knowing that when you're giving them numbers and talking about, hey, I know you bought the home in the previous 3 years. If you don't have your existing title policy, reach out to the company who closed it. Let's get that policy so we can get you a discount. It'll save you a few dollars. So
Sure.
that seller cost estimator that I showed you, saying you'll put $100,000, it might put an extra $500, $700 in your pocket.
Yay. Okay, so the line 293, 319, and 339 are all the same concept. So all it's saying is, okay, in the regular contract, you have the right to get inspections. So you get your inspections, and then the contract says, once you get your inspections, you have to report to the seller the items that are not to standards. And then, and you have to do that within a period of time. And then once the seller gets that list, the seller has a period of time to go get estimates of what those repairs are going to cost. And then if those repairs fall within the repair limit, then the seller has to fix them. And if the repairs fall outside, then either party can pay the difference or either party can cancel the contract and get their deposit back. All right. So that's all that says for all three items. So you get your termite inspection. You find out there's termites. The seller calls a termite company, gets an estimate to repair it. It falls within the limits. The seller has to pay for it. Falls outside the limit. The seller says, sorry, I'm not paying for it. The buyer says, okay, I'm walking, gets his money back. Or buyer says, you know what? I really want the house. I'll pay for the termite inspection. I'm not canceling the contract, which might be bad for the seller because maybe the seller had a backup for more money, but the buyer protects his interest in has the right to protect his interest. That's why I say this contract holds deals together better than an as is.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, we're seeing more and more people asking for this in this market because more buyers are writing as is contracts on multiple properties and just canceling the one they don't want. So you may not get as many offers, but the ones you're getting are serious buyers and they're better offers because that buyer can't just cancel for any reason.
That's right.
A couple questions here. What if a seller says, I'm not going to make repairs? Well, I mean, we can kick and scream all day long, but just like we said, the seller has a contractual obligation to make the repairs if they are within the repair limits. It says they will do that. If the repairs are within the repair limits, the seller shall make those repairs. Not will decide if they do it, shall make those repairs.
Seller's obligations. It's an obligation for the seller.
If they don't do it, they'll be in breach of contract. And your buyer has an obligation or a right to call that breach out and walk away if they want.
Or ask for damages.
Yep.
Which would be very expensive, but it does have that opportunity.
And then what else? What if the title policy was over 3 years ago? Then they just pay the normal rates for it. So it's just if you have a title policy within the previous 3 years, like if they just bought the home, it's been a shorter period of time between the last title search. It takes a little bit less work for them to create because they have the old title policy that protected all of that. They just need to do an updated title search so they can save them a few bucks by doing that.
Okay. All right. So in general, wood destroying organisms, permits, and general repair limits, same thing. Buyer gets the inspection. Buyer alerts seller of the defective ones. Seller gets estimated cost for those repairs. If it falls within the limits, the work gets done. Outside, we negotiate. Pretty simple. That's why you're picking. if you pick $500 and the termite inspection $750, the buyer can say, okay, so you pay the 500, I'll pay the 250, but I'm not canceling the contract. Either party can pay the difference.
Not
Very
in that
important.
section. Not in that section, no.
Except for
General-
termite.
Yeah, termites are the only section that the seller cannot force the buyer to buy. If, so either party can make up that difference or either party can cancel if the repairs are in excess. But with wood destroying organisms, it's the one section that says, if the repairs are in excess of the repair limits, then the buyer has the right to cancel or move forward. It doesn't say, that's the one section. It doesn't give the seller the right to be able to fix it and force the buyer to buy. So
It's
instead
also
of-
fun because it says if the seller previously treated the property for the type of wood destroying organism found by the buyer's inspection, seller does not have to retreat the property if there's no visible live infestation, and the seller at seller's cost transfers to buyer at closing a current full treatment warranty. I think it's kind of fun to say.
Who determines general repair limits? That's going to be the buyer and the seller together through negotiations.
It's 1.5% if left blank, and we don't leave blank. So you got to put something in there.
Yeah, a good beats 500 to $1,000 on some of our average prices, but maybe like if you're talking 500,000 to $1 million, maybe putting in there between $2,500 and $5,000 amount. It depends. It depends on the purchase price, but that's going to be a negotiation. And what about mold? Mold is not part of the wood destroying organisms. Well, it could be because it says that wood destroying organism. It doesn't specifically say mold. It says wood destroying organisms. So if there is that white mold that's there and it's marked as a WDO, they like to use the words WDO rather than mold because not every inspector is a mold detector. They don't want to throw that word around. So they call it wood destroying organism. And if it's a wood destroying organism that's called out, it needs to be addressed.
And that's why it's a wood destroying organism, not just a termite report. All right, so that's all the seller really has to do in the regular contract. Give a copy of the title commitment, give a copy of the survey,
Get estimates.
and get
within 10
estimates for the
days.
repairs.
Yep.
And then close any open permits 5 days prior to closing. We should probably talk about permits. So a couple of years ago, they changed the contract to include, give the buyer the right to do a permit inspection, which is a big deal nowadays, or could be a big deal. A lot of our older homes have had multiple owners. And over time, multiple owners have done repairs to their homes. And sometimes they did that with their cousin and didn't get a permit. And sometimes they did it with an experienced person and they got a permit. Many times, professional contractors open permits and never close them out. In which case, somebody's got to inspect the work and go close out the permit. Many times, people do work on their homes without permits, and it's a problem. Well, now they made permits a required item in this contract. So if the buyer finds there's open permits, then the seller has to close them out, which is really a problem when you bought the house and it had those problems done already. So it really pisses off a seller when they've got to close out a permit that was done 2 sellers ago. But this contract does that. It says it's a seller's obligation. Now, very clearly, we're saying that for this contract, the as-is contract, the seller has no obligation to close out permits. Seller has an obligation to assist the buyer, but he has no obligations to do the work. This contract, the seller is obligated to do the work up to the repair limit. So I'll give you an example. I checked when this law changed. I looked up my house. My pool permit was open, but never closed. So I wanted to close it. So I had to call an engineer. The engineer came out for $500 and inspected the system and wrote me a letter, said the system was fine. Then I drove that letter to the county office, building office, and I gave them the letter and I paid them $25 and they closed my open permit because my pool builder had passed away. Right. So that's why there's a permit repair limit. So that cost me $525. So the repair limit was $250. Then I could have made the buyer pay for that. I refused to pay for it. The buyer could have canceled, or I could have squeezed the buyer and said, no, I'm not going to pay just my $250 limit. And if you want the house, you got to pay the difference. It gave me some latitude, some wiggle room, some alternatives. Right. But it gave the buyer some alternatives too. So I could keep the deal together if I wanted to. I could force a party to stay in. I could not force a party to stay out because of the way this contract's written. And that same concept works for every other ones.
Yeah, so the seller will close out any open or expired permits, but also obtain permits for unpermitted work. So that's where we're finding that there are potential issues. So I don't know what the percentages are, but there is a lot of unpermitted work. Simple things like water heaters and AC units. They don't all pull permits when they put them in. They don't.
I just put a new water heater in. I said, are you gonna have a permit? He goes, nah.
They technically, they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Same thing with the AC units, but that happens all the time. If you accept a contract with repair limits that has $1,000 for open or expired permits and unpermitted work, you could have done a permit search and looked and saw there's no open or expired permits. But you didn't ask the seller about the AC and the water heater that they just had put in and that didn't have a permit because you overlooked it. And now you're potentially obligating them to have to get a permit for the AC and the water heater. And an inspector will call those things out. I didn't see any active permits for this, but it looks like the year is from last year. So this is a new unit. The seller would have to obtain a permit to have that that's an obligation under this contract.
So let's say, there was no permit and you're selling a house with this contract, what could you do?
You can put a very low amount for the repair limit for the permits, or put a $0 amount. Look, I'm not obligating to anything. I know there's no open or expired permits, and just leave it at that. But technically also, your property disclosure should be correct because the property disclosure asks about unpermitted work too. So if you know it wasn't permitted, you should be filling that out and then filling in the bottom there, AC did not have permit.
Correct. So I know some people that live in a house like mine that have lots of work that was done without permits. Right. So when they go to sell the house, they can't really sign this contract in good faith because they're saying, I don't know of any open permits or work done without permits. So they would disclose, hey, the work that was done in this house did not have permits. They closed in their garage downstairs or something like that. And they put air conditioning in and plumbing in and all the stuff they're not supposed to do. They couldn't get a permit because it's illegal to do, but it was done. So you don't want to not disclose that because it's a material fact. And it's okay. You can disclose anything you want.
Mike just chimed in and said replacement in kind usually doesn't require a permit. You're not a contractor and you're not the county inspector, number one. So I would be very careful with making that delineation. There's actually permits for equal changeouts. Why would they have a permit for an equal changeout of an AC unit when you're putting in the equal unit in? Anytime you remove those, putting in a new one, you're supposed to get a permit from my understanding. And that's what I would go by and not make that designation there that it's usually doesn't require, because what if you tell a seller that and then it does require it and all of a sudden they're upset about it?
I'm going to check that out because I had both licensed AC people and water heater people, plumbers, replace mine, and neither one of them got a permit.
Yep, they typically don't. I see a lot of them don't.
So maybe Mike's right. I don't know. I'm gonna check on that. That would be nice to know.
I just had some guys come out and they were looking at mine, and because my AC unit, I'm going to need to replace it. And they're going to put the same thing in. And anytime that they pull out the units that are there, they have to get a permit for it. And if they can't just replace one, they have to pull both of them out. And they're supposed to pull both of them out and they need to get a permit for it whenever they do it.
They changed the Freon. It's not Freon now. It's the other stuff.
Yep. So that's probably why. It's probably something like that. But my understanding is right now that if they pull anything out, they have to get a permit to put it in. But many don't. Many won't get it because technically it's not a huge deal if they're just putting a water heater in, but you're supposed to. We got shut down on a property that I have an investor working on because he didn't pull a permit when he changed out a sink in a vanity. The guy was inspecting the roof. The guy was inspecting the roof and he said, "Hey, I don't see any permits for the plumbing." He goes, "Yeah, we just changed out the vanity." He goes, "Did you cut the pipe?" He said, "Yeah." He goes, "You need a permit."
Wow.
In Plant City, they're really strict with that when they catch it. They're just trying to cut down on unpermitted work.
Yeah, on their county by county things change too.
Yes,
Hillsborough County is one thing. City of Tampa is another. City of Madeira Beach is different than the city of Indian Rocks Beach, which is different than the city of St. Petersburg.
Correct.
I mean, there's all kinds of municipality things that go on too.
So the clear thing is, hey, if you've done work check with the county and see if it requires a permit. My thought is going to be, if you're pulling a whole air conditioning unit out and putting the same one in, let's double check, but I would assume you probably want to get a permit, especially, that's what I was told, that when they pull it out, they have to get it and they have to get a permit. They can't just take one unit out and put another one in because of the change out and the energy laws that are out there now, and they would need to get a permit for it to have it inspected.
Cool. All right, so that's all a seller's got to do. It's really not that onerous, but it points out to them, hey, this is your obligation, seller. Let's abide by the terms of the contract. Then this critical date timeline goes through and explains the buyer's obligations, which are very similar, but different. Make your initial escrow deposit, make your additional escrow deposit. Notify the seller of your loan approval or cancellation. This is probably the most important part right here.
Yes.
Notify the seller. The buyer has the obligation to notify the seller of loan approval or cancellation due to financing 30 days by default. Also see line 111 below. Okay. Critical date.
Well, I think you made a clear point. It's not the lender notifying the seller, it's the buyer.
And a lot of attorneys are pissed off about that.
The buyer has to feel comfortable and confident with what the lender told him to deliver written notice of loan approval to the seller. The buyer does that. And if the buyer doesn't do that by that date, the contract clearly gives the seller some rights. So that's what Craig was talking about earlier. Loan approval date is absolutely key here, because if the loan approval date comes and passes and your buyer did not deliver loan approval, you've just opened up for a potential cancellation from a seller for 3 days.
Right here, line 111, seller may cancel within 3 days of loan approval expiration date if buyer has not received or did not provide, it should say.
Yeah. So buyer, if your buyer can say, I've got loan approval, and they could have no clue. If they say they've got loan approval, they're basically, all they're doing is they're agreeing to waive their protection by delivering loan approval. That's what they're doing.
Big important stuff. I usually, when I have a board with me, I'll draw something out for you with a timeline. Your offer gets accepted, and then you've got your loan application period, and you got your inspection period, and your loan approval period, and you got all these dates that have to work together. When you put it on a timeline, you see how it kind of flows and makes sense, ultimately leading to your closing date. We'll get to that another day when I learn how to do a whiteboard on Zoom. All right, so buyer, deposit, additional deposit, loan approval, critical. Buyer has the right to get a survey. What's the opinion on a survey, Chris?
You should always get one.
Period. End of story. Always. You're a moron if you don't.
Always. Even if the seller provides you with one, I get it, but
update it.
You need to make a determination if that survey, depending on how old the survey is and what changes have been done. The lender might not even approve the survey if it's too old, or if there's certain changes that have been done to the property that are not noted on that survey. So always, 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 always have a survey on the property.
What if the neighbor put some curbing in around their landscaping beds, and they just, like my neighbor just put a brick paver walkway around his house? I know damn well he encroached on my property. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't have a survey to show it. That thing was done after it, but I know darn well he did.
Well, it's also going to call out other things. What do you guys in the Symphony Isles have that a lot of other places don't? Shared wells.
Oh yeah.
So it's going to call out, let's just say, I mean, we've had that pop up, whereas buyer had no idea because they weren't disclosed and no one told them there was a well on the property. And then you find out, well, not only is there a well on the property, you share it with the neighbor. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you that part too. And you both have to pay for it to be fixed, but there's no agreement in place. So that survey is going to find some of those things. It's going to find the well on the property. It's going to find those items.
Yep. All right. Oh, we're going to spend a little time on this one. Oh, buyer gets a survey. Option to terminate due to flood insurance. Applicable 20 days. Default 224. Flood insurance, you're going to hear me talking about a lot. I've raised the stakes. I've gone to Florida Realtors. I've gone to GTAR. I've gone to the state. I'm now talking with FEMA directly. This thing is wrong. As a matter of fact, Kathleen just shared something with me. Oh, I gotta move this. I'll show you. Inbox. Oh, yay. NAR new flood rates debut October 1 unless Congress acts. The Biden administration doesn't plan to stop FEMA's risk rating from going into effect, leaving congressional leaders to decide. NAR backs the new structure that charges by individual home rather than flood zone, but it's facing opposition from other real estate groups. Thank you. This is a big deal, guys. Not short term, but long term and disclosure wise, it's a big deal. So that being said, more to come. But I gotta open up.
Since it's such a huge deal, your buyer has some rights built into the contract.
Right.
And now it's becoming an even bigger deal where your buyer has to has a timeline that's already dedicated in here for the contract for them to determine if the property is in a special flood hazard area or is below the base flood elevation. It's up at the top of the page.
I want to see line numbers.
224.
Okay. There you
So
go.
it's if left blank 20 days. If the property's in a special flood hazard area, your buyer will have 20 days to identify the flood insurance and identify the elevation and determine if it's going to be a property they would like to move forward with.
Well, here's an example of something that an insurance agent told me. There's a community here called South Shore Falls, built by Centex. I actually brokered the land sale. When Centex built the homes, they went to FEMA and they purposely built the homes 2 feet above the required base flood elevation. And in consideration, FEMA changed it from an AE zone, because it's west of 41, to an X zone, which does not require mandatory flood insurance. These new maps took South Shore Falls and put it into an AE zone. And now under FEMA's 2.0 policy, the flood insurance cost for a home in South Shore Falls is $5,000 a year, which is $400 and something a month, which is a nice car payment for a bunch of families. There's gonna be some pissed off people. So that's what I'm championing around right now. So anyway, this is an automatic. So what I want us to do is when we get a listing in a special flood hazard area, we go to have the seller go to their insurance carrier or agent and get a rated rate. And this is a big discussion point because when I told the guy that's working with me from FAR, Florida Realtors, he told somebody at NAR, and the NAR wrote back, said, your customer's mistaken. He's not going to go from 1,000 to 10,000. He's only going to go up 18% a year. Yeah, I'm going to go up 18% this year, and then 18% next year, and then 18% the year after that, and then 18% the year after that. You know, it's going to take me 12 years to get to my $10,000 flood insurance, but I'm going to have a $10,000 flood insurance bill, right? 18% a year cap. So I don't want, this is your contract's going to give you an automatic 20-day cancellation. And if you don't call this shit out up front, your buyers are going to cancel. So I want my sellers to find out what it's going to be. And honestly, you know, this is me being an alarmist. This will devalue the property value.
Yeah,
it really will. So when a buyer finds out I'm going to be paying $10,000 a year for flood insurance, your house is not worth as much to me now as it was before when it was only $1,000 a year. Sorry, it's going to happen.
and it's not enough to just put an elevation certificate because it states that it's a proximity and location to water, not the elevation that's going to determine what the rates are. So an elevation could help, but what they need to do is they need to go get their insurance quote. They need to verify and make absolute certain that it's an assumable policy. And if it is, that's going to be a huge thing for them. They need
For the
to
short
get
term.
for the short term, get a elevation certificate. That way they have everything that they possibly could need to be able to provide to a buyer. And when you've done that, then you can go onto that blank and you can lower the timeline on that blank. Mr. Buyer, you're getting a 7-day inspection period or 10-day inspection period. I'm only giving you 10 days on this flood to determine because you have everything you need. You got my insurance lady, you've got my quote, you got my elevation. You go to your people, you don't need more than 10 days. You're not going to drag this out any further.
Just for reference, I gave my elevation certificate to my insurer, which shows I'm 5 feet above the required base flood elevation, and it knocked my premium down from 10,000 to 9,000. Which is really stupid because the water would have to come up 18 feet before I could even make a claim. And the claim would only cover $250,000 worth of stuff. And there's no way they would have to, I mean, the worst it could do is eat my cabinets and my baseboards. It became 19 feet and the water's never been that high. So it's just a stupid concept, but it's a big deal. Stay tuned. As I learn more, you'll learn more. But that buyer has an option in this contract and we might as well call it out. And to Chris's point, I personally would do what he said, disclose it all up front, and I'd shorten that time period. Because I don't want to tell the seller, yeah, your 7-day inspection period is done. We locked them in, guys. And you got another 13 days for them to cancel due to flood insurance.
Yep. In
a special flood hazard area only.
Couple questions. What if it's a mobile home, not even worth the 200K and the NFIP covers? Talk with your insurance provider.
And talk with your lender.
That's part of the problem. Some of it doesn't make sense, but you're just going to have to talk with your insurance provider. Local news station said flood insurance also depends on history of the area, not just elevation and proximity. Yeah, that's what the flood zone determination typically comes from. You know, the flood history of the area. So yeah, they're considering that as well. Is the seller obligated to provide an elevation certificate? The contract says they are obligated to provide a survey within 5 days. It doesn't say elevation certificate. If the seller has a copy of their existing survey, if they don't have a copy of it, they can't.
I would get it.
They don't have, but I would tell them to get it. But it's not an obligation for them to provide. But I would be telling our sellers, get a copy of it. Call your insurance provider. They should probably have a copy of it on file as well that they could send them if they have flood insurance.
Yep, I agree. Line 261, buyer has the right to conduct a home inspection at their expense. Buyer to provide repairs to seller. So where seller has to get the repairs done up here, the buyer has to provide the required repairs for the 3 areas.
Let's note 2 differences between as is and this contract. This says buyer to conduct home inspection. The as is timeline does not say that because the buyer doesn't have to do an inspection in an as is contract. There's no obligation for them to do it. In a residential contract with repair limits, the buyer has to do an inspection by
with a licensed contractor.
Yep, by a licensed inspector, licensed or a licensed contractor, licensed in the field of what they're inspecting. That's a key discrepancy.
As is, I could bring my dad with me.
Yep.
So we inspected the house, we don't want it.
Yep.
Because the moon cast a shadow on the corner of the house that didn't feel right.
Yep.
I don't have to give a reason. Any reason whatsoever. So repairs, WDO, and permits, the buyer has to do that. Then the buyer has the right or obligation to do a walkthrough inspection. We should talk about that a little bit, Chris, because that's good advice on walkthrough inspections. Understanding, once you buy the house, you own the house. So if the water softener was there when you looked at the house, and then you closed and you moved in and the water softener is gone, you're kind of screwed. You should have called that out during your walkthrough inspection and say, hey, you didn't get it. Good luck tracking down the seller now.
We get a lot. This happens a lot. A lot of people call and say, hey, we were moving in and we noticed the seller didn't do this. And they said they were going to, and it was part of the contract. Who do I go after? Well, you're probably talking to the person that you should go after, number one, because your agent didn't do their duty of doing a walkthrough with you and letting you know this was our time frame to verify that everything that was supposed to be done per the contract was completed and go to be able to look through those things. You're probably talking to that person already that you probably want it, that you need to have some words with, because that was your timeline to do it. And then secondly, they got to turn the finger around and point it right back at them, because that was your time frame. And the minute that you signed the contract, you're accepting of every term of the contract and it's getting closed out. It doesn't say this term shall survive the closing. There is 1 or 2 things that says this shall survive the closing. The inspections aren't one of them. Your closing on the property says that all of the terms of the contract have been met and I'm closing out on it and accepting of it. And if you accept it, that's your problem now. I'm sure they can
Your
find
Honor,
an attorney.
I gave the buyer this little obligation sheet that told them they had the right to do it. The contract told them they had the right to do it. I told them they had the right to do it. They chose not to do it. Not my fault.
I'm sure they'll find an attorney that'll try and sue the seller and go through all these steps to do. I'm sure they could find one, but that
Yeah, but who's going to
costs
spend
money.
$10,000 to get a $2,500 water softener?
Exactly. So it doesn't make sense. So this is part of our duty, especially if you're a single agent, to abide by and adhere to these timelines and timeframes and make sure the buyer fully understands what their rights and obligations are.
And the buyer has the right to examine the title evidence 5 days after receipt from the title company, and that may extend closing.
Yep.
I addressed that up here.
Yep.
Right. And then number 481, advise seller of any survey defects. Seller, I got a survey. There's some defects. You need to get them cured. I bought a house in Brooksville and the fence was 25 feet into my property, meaning the neighbor was using 25 feet of the property that we bought. And if I didn't have a survey, I wouldn't have done it. And then we had the seller move the fence so we could tell the neighbor that's not your property because they were using it like it was theirs. But I had to get a survey to prove that, especially with land, guys.
Yes. Yep.
I remember we sold the wrong lot once.
Yeah. That's why legal.
When you get 7 vacant lots in a row, how do you know which one's lot 4? Could be this one, could be this one. And we showed the lot, said, look at this beautiful tree on lot 4. And they surveyed and the tree's on lot 3. I'm making those numbers up, but you get the concept.
There's a chat here. Have a walkthrough morning of closing. You find missing items. Can the buyer walk? It's not that the buyer can walk. You're noticing that a term of the contract has not been met, and it's your duty to call that out and give the seller the option. Because technically, if you're closing that day, the seller has till the end of the day to meet the terms of the contract. Your buyer can't just walk. The seller has timelines and rights and obligations themselves. They have the obligation to sell the property at the terms of the contract. And if the terms of the contract aren't met, they still have till the end of that day to fulfill those terms.
If the seller refuses, then the buyer would call the seller in breach, which would get the buyer the deposit back, or they could sue for damages, which would probably never happen. So there's not you guys always want black and white answers, and we don't really have black and white answers very often.
Yep.
And even if we did have black and white answers, the enforcement of the rule is many times more expensive than another solution.
You hear it all the time. You hear it all the time. The contract says the seller will do that, and they didn't do it.
Yes.
All right. Well, tell me how you're going to force them to.
You got married and said you were going to love, honor, and cherish the rest of your life. The lawyers make more money on that one too.
Yeah.
All right. So that's buyer obligations. Nothing really onerous here, right? So we went from the intake form, really nothing a lot. Here's really simple things for people to do. And then I always like to pull out, because people think, just like you said, but the contract says we're closing on September 12th. Well, it does, but shit happens. And here's some shit that could happen. The CFPB will not close a loan, will not allow the lender to close a loan until the buyers receive the closing docs in their true form for at least 3 days, so they can digest it, because the mortgage meltdown in the 05, 06, 08 period of time just made buyers sign stupid loan docs with all kinds of terms they didn't understand. So in an effort to cure that, the Consumer Protection Finance Bureau says all borrowers have to understand their loan terms, and we can't force them into high-speed pressure deals. They got 3 days or it's not closing, and there's no extension to that. I mean, there's no avoiding that. It's 3 days period. So if you're closing on the 12th and the buyer wants to close and the seller wants to close, but they didn't get the disclosure out until the 11th, you ain't closed until the 14th, right? It's just, you're not doing it.
And it's not I'm just not going to close because the
I'll
closing
waive
date
my
is
rights.
this time. You can't do both sides. The
Automatic extension.
buyer can't waive it, and the seller can't say, well, no, you have to close. The contract says it shall extend up to that timeline. It doesn't say all parties will agree, or all parties, if they agree. It says contract shall extend to a time frame feasible to give that time frame an allowance to pass. So up to 10 days.
Yep. And then up to 70. So if there's a hurricane or a storm or a major act of God and we lose utilities, you can extend closing up to 7 days, but no more than 30 days due to force majeure. So Hurricane X comes through and damages stuff and you're supposed to close. You've got your insurance. The seller's got insurance. The house isn't too badly damaged, but there's no utilities, you don't have to close until they get restored. But if it takes longer than 30 days, you don't have to, you can cancel.
Yes.
Number 111, seller may cancel within 3 days of loan approval expiration date if buyer's notice was not received. I'm just calling that out because I want people to know about it.
In this market, that is a huge thing for your seller. We're all,
Yes.
if you have a listing, you're getting offers sometimes after you're under contract, you're getting phone calls, you're getting buyers that want to be in a backup position. And if you get to this point and they have not delivered loan approval by the loan approval date, start making some phone calls. Start calling those other offers if you don't already have a backup offer, and see if you can't line one up as a backup offer and cancel that buyer.
It's nice to hold a buyer's feet to the fire. Hey, buyer, step in line, or I'm going to cancel you and take another offer.
And it doesn't say it just says the seller may cancel the buyer. It doesn't say the buyer will agree to it. It says seller may cancel. If buyer does not do this, seller may cancel them.
And here's your money back.
You send them a written cancellation with the money their escrow deposit going back to them, and the buyer does not have a choice.
Then there's an automatic closing delay for up to 10 days if the seller doesn't close any open or expired permits. Big deal in this contract, not in the as is. Big deal in this contract.
And a big deal in these times when the counties are behind with a lot of, number one, the contractors are behind. Number two, the county is behind in processing and updating. So it's becoming issues. So this is why it's important for us to stay on top of these things.
And then up to 5 days, the seller fails to deliver the title commitment to the buyer prior to closing.
Yep.
See, you call these things out and then there's less chance of them happening. But you know what, Chris, for fun, let's go back and I'm going to type in critical and let's look at the as is real quick. Look, how many fewer obligations on the seller, how many fewer obligations on the buyer, and the same closing delays potentials.
And this is why agents write in for convenience of seller. We're selling it as is, but how convenient is it for you to put a property on the market, take it off the market as is contract with no teeth, nothing binding it, and the seller just has to sit there with their hands in their pocket and hope the buyer doesn't cancel them? How convenient is that really? It's convenient because they don't have to do a couple of extra things, but
be lazy.
Yeah, that's more like it. It's not really a convenience for them.
Seller is lazy and so is agent. Please deliver as is contract. Paraphrase the MLS remarks. Seller is deceitful and agent is lazy. Please do as is contract. We don't want to mess with permits and stuff that we didn't do. Now, there are cases where you want an as is contract.
Yep.
And let's have this session real quick because I have this little theory. When you buy a foreclosure, what do you get? What's the typical, what do you think you're getting when you get a foreclosure? A deal, right?
Yeah.
It's going to sell for less, right? Get a foreclosure. What kind of contract does a bank use when they sell a foreclosure? An as is contract, right? Because they're basically not warranting anything, which means it's worth less. So then some agents, and this is a Tampa Bay thing. Chuck, you're online. What's happening in West Palm? Are they using as is contracts there or regular? I know Miami, they use regular contracts more. As is are hardly ever used. It's just the markets have different things. We'll talk about when we get to title insurance too. All right. So does that make sense? Critical date timeline, real important for you guys to understand in and out. The contract intake form, really important to help you make sure you understand everything you need to write a proper contract. Right. And then we'll switch. Chris, I need to get about 1 minute break to fill my water jug.
Good.
And I think I've still got this contract open.
Yep. I'm going to go through some of the chat and address some of those while you do that then.
Okay.
There's a couple other little things. So foreclosure and HUD houses are as is. Yep, absolutely, Mike. As is 100%. Chuck said over in West Palm, I used a regular, and the other agent said, "What is this?" That's a common thing. You hear that a lot. What is this? But what you'll find here, we're seeing it more. Some of the more diligent agents are becoming a little bit more suggestive of using a residential with repair limits. Mike, don't buy a house if there's a hurricane in the Gulf. You can't buy insurance. That's right. Once a storm comes inside that box, you won't be able to bind insurance, which means you won't be able to close. Seller obligated, no, local news. Talking about flood insurance in sinkhole areas. In sinkhole areas, you're going to have some insurance issues, but we're covering this contract, so there's nothing in the contract per se that addresses sinkholes unless you want to add some protection for the buyer for sinkhole protection. Well, because they have a sinkhole disclosure that you can put in. As is really isn't as is. The buyer still go after repairs. That's right. So an as is contract is supposed to be the intent was we're selling you this property in its current condition as it is. We're not warranting anything or making any repairs. We're willing to accept it at this price because of that. And you come in and you make an offer, and the seller has every right to say, if you ask for repairs, Mr. Buyer, I accepted your offer as is on the condition of this price with me not doing anything. If you had wanted those things, you should have given me an offer with repair limits, and I would have accepted a different price knowing I was going to make repairs to this. So you will see that a lot. Like it's really not as is. Everybody's writing an as is contract and asking for repairs. You have to be really diligent with your timelines, because the residential contract with repair limits gives you that timeline that you have to do. The inspection period says you'll do your inspection within this timeline. Then you're going to notify the seller of any defects, and then the seller has time to get estimates for repairs and then work that out. The as is just says you're either buying the home or you're not. So once that inspection period comes, with a residential, all you have to do is deliver a list of the defects. And then the inspection period could be up, but there's obligations that the seller has to get get estimates for those repairs. Even if it goes after the inspection period, that's what it says will happen, and that's okay. And then as is, if you make a request for repairs, then what? If you're on the last day of your inspection period, and you ask for repairs, the timeline does not get extended. The timeline does not say the seller will get estimates, and by the time that's done, they'll let you know, and then you could decide if you're going to cancel or not once you have those estimates and know whether they're going to fix it or not. It doesn't say that. So that's why it's important that when you get to the end of your inspection period with an as-is contract, your only obligation is to buy the home and move forward or cancel the contract. If you're asking for repairs, you have to pay attention to that timeline, because if the end of that day comes and you're not canceled, you're buying that home and your rights have been forfeited. I used to work in New Jersey. There's no such thing as is. We sued the regular type, although we had the 3-day attorney review, which I will not get into, or we used the regular type, though we had a 3-day attorney review.
Michelle also says, why did they refuse to pull a permit? Then they breached the contract. Then you disclose it. I mean, those are your options. Like I sold a house over here. They had a bathroom downstairs they weren't supposed to have. We disclosed it, that there was a bathroom downstairs. Would you like us to pour concrete down the pipes and remove the goods? And they said, no, keep it, we'll keep it. So we disclosed it. So they couldn't say, well, you had it open. Yeah, we did. And we told you, and you're okay with it. So we're good.
Yeah, the contract creates rights and obligations. If somebody doesn't fulfill those rights or fulfill any obligations, they are deemed to be in breach of contract. And then at that point, we've got to determine, okay, well, what do we do? And like Craig said, sometimes it's easier to find another alternative to the contract rather than going through the hassle of trying to sue somebody, force somebody, and make everything happen. The buyer wanted the home. The seller wanted to sell it. Can we figure out a way to make it work? That's why we have to be the calming force in these transactions. If repairs exceed repair budget, do they have the option to renegotiate the repair budget amount? In a residential contract with repair limits, you deliver a list of defects. The seller has 10 days to get estimates. If the repairs are within the limit, the seller will fix them. If the repairs are in excess, one of 3 things can happen. The buyer can agree to accept it at the repair limits and tell the seller which items they want fixed up to the repair limits. The seller can agree to fix everything and force the buyer to buy the home. Or if neither one of those things happens within 5 days of the last estimate provided, Only then can the buyer or the seller, either or, may cancel this contract. Part of that is the buyer and seller negotiate. So let's say you have a $5,000 repair limit, the repairs are 10,000. Let's say they just agree to do 6 or 7. Yes, they're going to move forward. You can negotiate that. That's what that 5-day period is for. But if neither party does that within 5 days, either of them can cancel.
All right, so do you want to jump into addendums now, or do you want to jump into the everything but the blanks?
Let's talk about the everything but the addenda. They're pretty straightforward for the most part. I think they'll get more out of the items that are actually inside of in between all these blanks.
I think we covered this one okay.
Yep.
Make sure you check the MLS to see what's included and then verify that it's in the house. And if you want it and it's not listed, ask for it. If you don't want it, exclude it and tell them to get it out of there. Time for acceptance, I think we nailed that pretty well, except for these details. So a time for acceptance automatically has a 48, a counter offer has an automatic extension or
2 days.
extension of the time for acceptance of 2 days. So if I offered you 500 for your house and you countered at 510, your 510 offer is open for 2 days. So if you get another offer at 510 and you assign that one at 515 and you sign that one, but you don't cancel mine, mine's still open for 2 days. I can sign mine for 510 and then the seller sold his house twice. So you want to make sure you remember that when you get a counter offer from a seller, it's valid for 2 days and your seller is holding that offer open to you. Here, buyer, you have 2 days to decide if you want to take my counter offer.
Now,
Which means the seller better not accept something else between those 2 days. Or he needs to rescind his counter offer and say, my offer is off the table, I'm taking something else.
now we'll talk, it's one of the standards of the contract is time. And it talks about that's calendar days. That includes weekends. So that's 2 days. If you counter somebody on a Thursday, that's 2 days. That's Friday and Saturday. They have to answer by Saturday. Right? It says time for acceptance and effective date are the only 2 dates that can fall on a weekend or a holiday. So if this says that it'll automatically extend 2 days, extend the time for acceptance 2 days if you counter an offer. Time for acceptance and effective date can be a weekend or a holiday. So those 2 day extension can fall on a weekend.
Good effective date, occupancy and possession.
So I think this is important talking about, unless paragraph 6B, that's if there's a lease is checked, the seller shall deliver occupancy and possession of the property to the buyer, free of any tenants, occupants, and future tenancies. Also, seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage door openers, access devices, codes as applicable to the buyer. What does it not say the seller is going to do? Clean it, broom sweep it, make it presentable to the buyer, not be disgusting. That's where it started. They're going to remove all the trash and personal property. And they'll remove any tenants, occupants, or anything like that.
They don't got a vacuum, they don't got a sweep.
Nope.
They should, in my opinion.
Is it right? Should they? I think so. I would say it's a good thing to do and it's a good practice to have, but there's no contractual obligation. It also says they're going to give her keys, garage door openers, codes, and all that. If they don't have garage door openers, they don't have to provide them. A lot of people have them programmed to their car now and they don't even have the garage door openers. It says, look, it says, if I have them, I will deliver them if I have them. If I don't have them, I can't give you something I don't have. We've had people get upset about that and say, well, you need to give garage door openers. It says, no, it says, I'll deliver all of them. If I don't have them, I don't have to give them to you because I don't own them.
Right. Go to Home Depot and buy a universal remote.
But the subject to the lease part, if there is a lease there, you better be certain that you check this box. Check the box that this is subject to a lease, because anytime you're selling a property that's subject to a lease, the lease will supersede. The lease, the lessee, the tenant that's there will have rights, and you cannot just close on the property and kick them out. You have to abide by the terms of that lease that's in place. So in turn, as a seller,
Yeah, if you're leasing it to your sister-in-law for $100 a month, and she's got the right to live there for 4 years, that house is not worth a lot of money.
nope. Yep. And then if you bought that home and you had all of these opportunities to review the lease, because it says what's supposed to happen, when you're supposed to deliver all of these things, you're supposed to deliver a copy of all of the written leases to the buyer within 5 days of the effective date. And then the buyer has within 5 days of that to review it and decide if they want to cancel based on what they have, based on what it is. So if I'm buying your property and I find out that there's a 2-year lease for $100 a month to your sister, I'm probably not going to buy that home because that's not a good investment. But you have 5 days to deliver that. And then the buyer then has 5 days to review after that and determine whether they're going to move forward with the terms as they sit.
Yep. Okay, under financing. I really want everybody to understand this clause very well. It's the same in both contracts as is in residential. And this is stuff that's, it's you're dead right. I like to use dead right because the contract says it, but if people don't agree, then what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
You know, you got to be strong enough to bend. Buyer's failure to use diligent effort to obtain loan approval during the loan approval period shall be considered a default under the terms of this contract. That's fine. Chris, will you define buyer's failure to use diligent effort?
I'm going to need to get a judge and attorney to do that.
Yep, I have no idea. So
I
I tried.
I've talked to the buyer. They've definitely been using diligent effort and good faith. But who determines it? There's no way that we don't determine those things. The only way you can is by getting an attorney in place and having a judge decide whether they did or not.
Right.
Your opinion doesn't matter.
And unfortunately, the lawyers and the judges cost more money than it's worth to solve the problem. So sometimes there's no justice there.
Yep.
And then the same thing, buyer agrees to keep the seller and broker fully informed about the status of the buyer's mortgage loan application, loan approval and loan processing, and authorizes the buyer's mortgage broker, lender, and closing agent to discuss such statuses with and progress and release preliminary and final executed closing disclosures and settlement statements to the seller and the broker. They said they're allowed to do it. Now, you know, some brokers, I'm not giving you that.
It says right here, you have to. The contract says you have to.
The speed limit sign says 55 on some of the roads around here.
Yeah.
And sometimes people violate that.
Yep.
So you can't be, standing on your soapstone saying, no, but it says, call it out, but just
Absolutely.
don't go making threats that you're going to sue somebody because you're probably not.
Exactly. So in the next section, we're really wanting to clarify that says buyer shall promptly deliver written notice of loan approval. Buyer. This isn't the lender gives loan approval, because we still have agents saying, I need the loan approval from the lender. Well, you don't have a contractual right. You can ask for it all you want, but the contract doesn't say I have to. It just says the buyer will deliver it. And if the buyer delivered it, they have fulfilled their rights and their obligation in the contract. And once they fulfill that obligation, that loan protection has been waived.
So a different perspective on that, which is not one that I share, but my old attorney, Hank, hates this provision. He says, no way am I allowing my seller to take their property off the market because a buyer says they have loan approval. I want it from the lender. And that's an argument that I can see. I don't agree with. I think the buyer takes the responsibility. The buyer should talk to their lender and say, hey, I've got to waive my loan approval. Do you feel comfortable with me doing so? Loan officer says, yes, I do. You're good as gold. Then the buyer says, hey, seller, I've got my financing. I'm waiving my contingency. Plan on me closing. And if I don't, you'll get my damage money for my deposit. But the buyer doesn't have to talk to the loan approval. They could just say it. Right? And the lawyers don't like that idea because they want some proof behind it. So basically a buyer could, if their closing date was far enough beyond loan approval period, to keep the house tied up off the market for an extra period of time.
Yep.
And I see that argument, but that's why we limit loan approval to closing date 5 to 10 days. You're really not losing that much.
And here's why some people don't like it, because the very next line, it says, if buyer is unable to obtain loan approval.
Mm-hmm.
Note in this paragraph, it doesn't say anywhere if buyer is denied their loan. It doesn't say it. It does not say the buyer got denied their loan. It says
so all the buyer says, hey, my loan officer said I can't qualify.
Yep. What
All I
if,
gotta do.
what if the loan approval date is coming up and the buyer knows that they don't have the documents that they need because they're, say, tax documents or whatever they are, and they're not going to be back for a week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks because the IRS is so backed up. The buyer will be unable to obtain loan approval. They're not denied their loan. They just don't have the documents that they need yet. They're not going to be denied. They eventually will be if they get to the point where there's no activity. But at that moment, the buyer is just unable to obtain loan approval within the timeline. Should they be penalized because they can't do it and it's out of their reach? No, they should be able to cancel this contract. Hey, look, I'm not going to be able to do it. Maybe we try to extend and see if everybody wants to, but if they're unable to obtain loan approval for something like that, they're not going to be penalized for it, and they're not denied their loan yet. So you have to understand that you can't just say, I need to see the denial. It doesn't say I got denied. It says I was unable to get my loan approval within the timeline allotted me.
After using diligent effort.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Then the next section is what we'd already talked about up at the top, line 109. If the buyer fails to timely deliver either notice, the seller may elect to terminate this contract by delivering written notice to buyer within 3 days after the expiration of the loan approval. 3 whole days. As a buyer's agent, you need to be absolutely clear and aware of this, because if you're dealing with a diligent agent on the other end who may just sit in the grass and just wait for that moment to come when day 31 comes and they have no notice and they've got a cash offer right behind you for $10,000 more, you're getting canceled, they're getting that offer, and your buyer can do nothing. And they're going to be looking at you saying,
Why didn't you tell me?
what the hell happened? How did we get here? What happened? And that's our duty. Yes, they're a party to the contract, but that's our duty to inform them of their rights and obligations.
Then they called me complaining. I said, don't talk to me, talk to Chris.
Yeah, call this number. So the next section, so some of this is actually going to change. So we're going to mention it now, but some of this is going to change in the next revision. There's only 3 reasons that the buyer can cancel this contract and get their deposit back if the loan approval date has passed or they've obtained loan approval or given that notice of it. There's only 3 reasons. It says if the loan approval has been obtained or deemed to have been obtained, meaning the date passed, and then the buyer fails to close, this says the deposit shall go to the seller unless it's for one of 3 reasons. Right now, number 1 is seller's default. If the seller defaults, they can't keep your money. Number 2, property-related conditions of the loan approval have not been met. And number 3, the appraisal of the property obtained by the buyer's lender does not meet the terms of the loan approval. So technically, if the appraisal comes back short and that appraisal does not meet the terms of the loan approval, then your buyer, even if the loan approval date has passed, your buyer can cancel this contract and get their deposit back per the contract.
Yep.
But there's a recent lawsuit, and there's a judge decided that the buyer, even though that had happened, it's still the buyer's responsibility to notify and cancel by loan approval, even if the appraisal hasn't been back. And I don't care what the contract said, I'm finding the buyer at fault. And that is going to change in the next revision. That will not be there. It'll be the buyer's full responsibility by the loan approval period to cancel if they're unable to obtain it and make sure that that appraisal is back, because that provision will not be there anymore in the next revision.
Anything that's not clear gets modified. And when it gets challenged by a court is when it becomes, well, that wasn't clear, we better reword it.
Yep. And the contract is pretty clear here that this is what it says. And a judge still said it's the buyer's responsibility and the buyer is at fault and they did not get their deposit back, even though the contract protected them and said that it did. He goes, no, they had a loan approval and they didn't do it. And they went after that, even though it says that, that's still their responsibility. So what do you do?
Did you cover Mike's question if the repairs exceed the repair budget? Do they have the option to renegotiate the repair budget?
Yes, we covered that.
And then we made a backup offer on a flip and the agent said the seller is not accepting backups.
There's nothing wrong with that. I'm right now, I think you have to make a decision as a listing agent and a seller. If it's in the seller's best interest to accept a backup offer that obligates them to a backup position when you might get a better offer down the road. You don't know. But
Right.
let's just say you have two offers and they're both cash and they're both 20,000 over. It's probably a good idea that you put the second one in a backup position, 20,000 over with terms that are really good for everybody, but it'd probably be a good idea to do that, but you don't have to accept any
But
backup
Chris's
offers.
point, in a rapidly accelerating market, if you get an offer at 320 today, multiple offers at 320 today, and you take the 320 and you take a backup at 320, and then it cancels a month from now, you put it back on the market active, you might get 330, 340.
Yes. So was it really in your best interest to accept a 320 backup offer when the loan approval period expires and the buyer cancels and you go back on market and you could get 10,000 more? Did you really do your seller a service by obligating him to that backup?
Hmm. Ooh, didn't mean to do that. Hold on. All right.
Next.
If prior to closing, seller is unable to meet the as-is maintenance requirement, a sum equal to, so I like when it prescribes what has, in the event this happens, this is how we're going to address it. Now we're looking at the as-is contract now, not the regular contract. The seller is required by paragraph, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to meet the as-is maintenance requirement shall be escrowed at closing. I'll tell you a story about that. And this was probably likely the seller did this on purpose. The bathroom had to be retiled. It was one of the as-is maintenance requirement. The seller couldn't get it done in time. So they got an estimate of $2,500 and they escrowed 125% of $2,500 to retile the shower. Well, guess what? The buyer closed. Then they came in to retile the shower, and guess what they found behind the drywall? Mold. So now that $2,500 tile job became a $15,000 bathroom redo, and the buyer is stuck. So it's a much better practice to have these repairs done on the seller's dime, on the seller's time, than for the buyer to acquire the property, because once they buy it, they own it. And it's now they can sue the seller. But are you going to sue us? You spend 10 grand on attorneys to sue a seller for 10 grand? Probably not.
But Craig, it says that if it actually exceeds that, the seller shall pay the actual cost. If it goes over that, the seller, it says right there, they have to pay.
Well, that's probably because the example I gave you was many years ago, but it just sunk in my head.
But even still, if it says that, okay.
After closing, good luck.
Go make them.
Yeah.
How do you do it? The only way you do it is by suing them, and it's going to cost you the same amount of money to sue them as it will be to fix it yourself.
That's right.
And that's where you have to have the strength and the attitude and the ability to convey that message. Look, I know you want to win, but this is just going to be a personal win, because you're going to spend the same amount, if not more, trying to sue them to get the seller to do it. It just doesn't make sense.
Yep.
And this goes back to Mike, your question that you had online was, if there's a problem on the property at the walkthrough, can the buyer cancel? No, it says right there, there's rights and obligations that need to be done, and they still have to meet those. So if there's something that needs to be escrowed, that's right there.
Yep.
Permit disclosures. This is basically saying that, except that may have already been disclosed in your seller's property disclosure, the seller does not know if any improvements made to the property were made without required permits or made pursuant to permits. This is here because of it's an as-is contract. So you have it right. You have the duty to disclose that to the buyer and let them know, because there is no permit repair section that's in a residential contract. So it's asking you to make sure that you disclose those things and stating in writing, I don't know of any of that. If I do, I put it on my property disclosure.
So this is problematic to me, because so often sellers don't want to complete a property disclosure statement. Bad idea, because they're making a disclosure in the contract. When they sign the contract, it says, except as may have been disclosed in a written disclosure, seller does not know of any improvements made to the property which were made without required permits. He's making that statement right now, and he's signing his name on the contract and initialing the page. And then the buyer finds out after closing that the seller did know something. Now he's got the seller in a lie. And that's called fraud. Johnson versus Davis, forget what year it was. gives the seller the obligation to disclose all known defects that are not readily observable. So at least if we filled out the disclosure, we as his agent are saying, seller, prod, please pay attention, answer these questions to protect them. And they go, well, I don't want to fill out a disclosure statement. That's dumb. Especially with an access contract.
Yep.
I guess I have opinions when these things come out.
Well, I mean, most of us don't think about that. We don't
Right.
think about that there's already a disclosure in the contract, and by signing this contract, the seller's obligating themselves by saying that I'm making this disclosure, except anything else I signed. Well, if you don't have a disclosure, you're making one. And that.
If I signed this as his contract and sold my house, I'd be lying. Because I
Yes.
know damn well I've got work that was done without permits.
Mhm.
And I didn't, if I didn't disclose it. Now, if I disclosed it in my property disclosure statement, I'm fine. Because you can do anything you want. You can disclose anything you want. Hey, Chris, I'm selling you a piece of shit that's going to fall down in a year. If you sign it and you pay for it, you got it. And you can't come back and say, oh, I'm suing Craig because he sold me a piece of shit that's going to fall down in a year. Told you.
The flood elevation, we covered that pretty well. Next section.
E is just fun to me. I think it's so
Yeah.
silly.
Just a quick, it's just a reminder to you that by signing this, by your buyer signing this, they're acknowledging receipt of the Florida Energy Efficiency Rating brochure. They're saying they got it. How many times do you deliver it? How many of these have you given to a buyer?
Well, we do because I had Angelique build into the .loop package.
But how
So
many
if-
times do you actually share it to your buyer? I'm
Well, you
asking
should.
anybody-
That's why we put it in there.
It's in the package so that you can share it to them, because it says that they're acknowledging receipt of it, and they should have it if they're contractually saying they're saying I received it. You should be giving it to them. As a single agent, that's something you should be doing when they're signing a contract saying they have it.
Okay, so this is important. These are all disclosures that are required. You know, it used to be we had to add individual disclosures. So let's cover these quick. Lead-based paint, anything built before 1978. It's telling them right now, here's
It's
the disclosure.
Mandatory.
Federal law.
Yeah.
Homeowners Association. We'll come back to that one. Property tax disclosure summary. Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act and seller's disclosure. There's another part about disclosure, right? Those are required disclosures. They're built into the contract. We've done our contractual job, but they need to be talked about. They don't need to be talked about. They're not on the intake form to talk about, but I want you to know they're there. So you got to remember, lead-based paint is a separate addendum if the house was built prior to 1978. The HOA disclosure is huge. So what I want you to do is have the HOA disclosure signed at the time of listing, and I want you to have it attached to the MLS, because the HOA disclosure has to be given to the buyer. And what does it say exactly? Until the buyer has received and read.
Should not execute this contract until buyer has received and read the homeowners association disclosure.
Now, the disclosure is not the documents. I think they should read the documents too. But the HOA disclosure just says, hey, buyer, you're buying in an HOA. The HOA has restrictions. You can find them online, and you know, the monthly fees are going to be this. But the buyer can cancel until they've received it. So if it's not given to them, it's another out in the contract. But by us having the seller sign it and posting it to the MLS, then we put the other agent on notice that it's here. And this contract in the legal term says notification to the agent is deemed as good as notification to the customer. So we've notified the agent of the HOA disclosure, which means we've notified the buyer. So now they can't cancel. If we don't give them the HOA disclosure for 15 days, they can cancel on day 14. So you never gave me the HOA disclosure, so I'm not closing. We don't want to do that. It's little tricks that we've got you covered, but these are things you got to follow through on.
Yep.
Property tax disclosure, I'm going to just say it for some of you that maybe really new. I bought my house 20 years ago, and it was only $350,000. And in Florida, my property value is capped at no more than 3% a year. So it's taxed at 350. Next year, 3% of 350 is about 10 grand. It could be worth 360. And then after that, it's like 375. And then it's like 385. So years down the road, I'm still dealing with assessed value in the 400s, but my neighbor's house sold for $1.2 million and his assessed value is $1.2 million. And then we both decide to sell our houses, and you're looking online at the tax statement. It says, oh, let's buy Craig's house because his taxes are only based on 485 and the one next door is $1.2 million. So we'll buy his. And that's the way people used to think. So you got to say, no. Florida's got the same Save Our Homes Act tax plan. You can't rely on what the owner's taxes are because you don't know their situation. They might have widowers exemptions or military exemptions or whatever, or they might be grandfathered in from so long ago of home ownership.
Yep.
Right. So it says, do not rely on the seller's current tax bill, because when you buy the house, we're going to reassess it based on your terms of ownership.
Yeah, in property listings in MLS, there's agents that are writing into the public remarks, low taxes. Your taxes are the same as the neighbors. You get charged the same amount. The taxes aren't any lower on this home than it is that home. They're only like that because of the person living there. When you buy the home, they're going to go up to what everybody else is at that just bought.
Really? You've seen that?
Taxes. Yes.
Oh my God.
They put it in. Oh, it's low
Hey,
taxes.
staff, if you're watching this, don't ever put that in MLS, please.
I just saw it the other day.
That would be considered misleading false advertising.
Yeah.
FERPTA. We've done a lot of work on FERPTA in the recent past. Go into the resource center, you'll see those. Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. If your seller is a foreigner, they really need to connect with a FERPTA lawyer and find out what their rights and obligations and duties are.
Upfront. Do that at the time of listing. Don't, when they're signing documents, get them in contact with somebody right away. Don't wait until you get a contract. Get them talking with somebody right away so that they fully understand what the rights and obligations are.
This is a scary part about an as-is contract. It says, seller knows of no facts materially affecting the value of the real property which are not readily observable and which have not been disclosed by buyer. Perfect, easy. Except as provided, oh, stop it, Craig. Except as provided for in the preceding sentence, seller extends and intends no warranty and makes no representation of any type, either expressed or implied, as to the physical condition or history of the property. I'm shivering in my boots with the legality of that statement. I extend and intend no warranty and make no representation of any type. Once you buy this house, you can't come after me anymore. Now, if you prove that I knew and didn't disclose, you can sue me for non-disclosure. But if I didn't know and I can prove that I didn't know, you can't sue me. That's scary. That's why an as-is contract, and people don't understand, that's why foreclosures sell for less, because the bank is not extending any warranty or representation of the condition of the property. Right? That just take example of that.
Yep.
Property maintenance, you have to maintain the property and the condition. You can't stop house is sold, I can stop mowing the lawn and cleaning the pool.
Nope.
No, you got to do all the stuff you normally do, maintain the property.
Walk through really quick. It's just making a point. It only says on the day prior to closing date or on the closing date. We get a lot of buyers that want to come back with their aunt and come back with their cousin or their family member, and I want to show them the property. Once your due diligence period is up, you don't have any right to go back to the property. So it's probably a good thing if your seller allows them to come back so they don't think you're trying to hide anything. But your buyer has no right to go back to the property until the closing date or the day before the closing date to perform their walkthrough, solely to confirm that all items of personal property are on the property that are supposed to be there and verify that the property has been maintained in the required as-is maintenance requirement standard. That's it. But a lot of us, the buyers, get upset when they can't go back to the property multiple times. The contract doesn't give them the right to.
No, and some sellers are really
very
sticklers on that.
stern on it. Yeah,
They don't want you in their
They
house.
don't want to allow it. This is only on the as-is because there is no concept for the repairs. If the buyer's inspection of the property identifies open or needed building permits, the seller shall promptly deliver all plans that they have related to it and will assist in closing out those permits or obtaining them, not pay for, not do the work, not get them. it's their house. They're the only one that can sign off for these permits because they're the homeowner. That's basically what it means. I will assist because I'm the person who owns the home and I'm the only one that can really sign off and help you do that. But I don't have any obligation to do anything other than assist. I don't have to pay for anything, close them out, obtain, nothing. Don't have to do it. And then just something that we don't think about a lot too, going further down to the next page, assignment of repair and treatment contracts and warranties. At buyer's option and cost, seller will at closing.
Chris, I got something at my door real quick. I'll be right back.
Yeah, that's fine. Buyer will assign all assignable repair, treatment, maintenance contracts and warranties to the buyer. The seller will at the buyer's option and cost. So if the seller has these maintenance warranties, treatment warranties, and things like that, at their option, at the buyer's option, they will be transferred. But it doesn't say the seller will automatically transfer them over. If there's costs incurred with it, it says that it's at the buyer's option and cost. So keep those things in mind. It's not just something that has to be done. It's the buyer's option and cost. Escrow agent. This basically says that failure of funds to become collected shall not excuse buyer's performance. So this is really important when we're talking about delivering escrow. The escrow has to be delivered within 3 days. If that's the box that's checked on the contract, delivered within 3 days. If the escrow is not delivered, or let's say the buyer initiates the wire, but for some reason it doesn't get there in time, that is not an excuse for the buyer's performance. Just because it was not delivered there is not or it wasn't collected by the escrow agent, that's not an excuse for the buyer. The buyer has a duty and has to make diligent effort to get that there and make sure it can become collected by the escrow agent. So failure of funds to be collected shall not excuse the buyer's performance. So just because it doesn't get there on time, you can provide them proof that you initiated it. If the escrow company doesn't have it, your buyer can still be found in default. That's a concern, which is why we want to make sure that we have our critical date timelines and remind the buyer of what their duties are.
Do you guys like the idea of the critical date timeline?
I do. I think it's powerful.
It literally will take you what? Yeah, I'm gonna hand raise. Nice.
3 to
4
5
minutes.
Yeah.
Fill it out. It's in dot loop.
Yep.
Oh, by the way, to those of you online, thank you for all the referrals for tile companies, roofers. I've got 3 coming out today. Julie's son-in-law, Kim gave me a reference, or Maria gave me a reference, and somebody else did. So there you go. All right, where were we, Chris? Because we're over time now.
Yeah, we're getting overtime, so we can just kind of find the main points and point out anything that really stands out. It talks about buyer and seller default and what the rights are, and pretty standard title evidence. It talks about that.
Chuck wanted me to talk about title evidence, so let's talk about that real quick. This is a Florida state contract, and so it's governs the entire state of Florida. And there are some twerks, and Chuck's over on the East Coast. And where's the section where it talks about?
Go down. It's on the, keep going. Right there at the top.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. So Florida contract, everything is subject to local custom though. So, you know, we started our business here in Tampa. Tampa does some wacky stuff. Like the listing brokers charge an MLS fee. So when you sell a house in Tampa, the listing broker will pay you 3% minus $300 or some arbitrary number for an MLS fee. That's not done in Manatee County and Sarasota County. It's done here. So it's local custom. Tampa's local custom is buyer picks, buyer pays, or seller picks, seller pays. I'm sorry. Title insurance. Seller picks title company and seller pays for title insurance. Standard. Manatee and Sarasota, standard, buyer picks, buyer pays, which actually makes more sense. Because the buyer is going to live in the house. Why would I put the insurance company is going to give me title insurance, right? But when we're filling out this contract, it says title evidence and insurance, blah, blah, blah. Check 1. Seller shall designate the closing agent and pay, or buyer shall designate the closing agent and pay. And then there's a third option that says for Miami-Dade Broward regional provision. And I don't remember the history right now. I was raised in Miami, but I never sold real estate there. Something happened where the title records were lost. And so that's really a pain in the ass to get title insurance because they don't have the history of records. The title plants don't go back very far. So in Miami-Dade and Broward County, they use what's called a abstract of title, which is not insured. It just says, hey, we've checked out the title, and from what we can see, it's good, but we're not insuring it back to the beginning of time. Right. So if you're in Miami-Dade, you would check that, but you're in Palm Beach, Chuck. So I don't think that is reference to you, but I'd have to do more research on that, but I said I'd address it.
Yep.
There's your time provision. This is a big one, guys. And let's have a couple things, Chris, that we just want to address. When is the end of the day? It's really not clear. It doesn't say. So some people think it's 5 p.m. because look right here, it says 5 p.m. But it also says, which shall end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday shall extend to 5 p.m. where the property is located the next business day. That's the only place it says 5 p.m. So when is your loan approval period up? On September 22nd. At 5 p.m.? I don't know. It doesn't say. Midnight? I don't know. It doesn't say. I would presume midnight, right? You might want to act as if it's 5 to get it out of the way, but it's likely midnight if you need to know.
So
that was the one we got caught on.
Yeah. And so let's just say this, you have a buyer who's using a lender that's in California, who's licensed in Florida, and you have your deadline is today for your loan approval. Just because I don't give it to you by 5 p.m. in the county where the property is located at doesn't mean that I should be penalized by 3 or 4 hours because my lender who writes in there still is working for another couple hours till the end of business. Right. So I technically have till that deadline. It's just a date. The deadline is on the date, not a timeline, unless it got extended due to a weekend or a holiday. So a deadline is for that date. And if the day ends at 11:59 would be your last opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's not clear. It doesn't say that with certainty. It just says this is the date. The only place it ever says 5 p.m. is in the time provision. That's the only place it says that.
So where we got burnt, and I'm not afraid to share this, we had a time period and a loan approval and on Saturday. And so we got extended till 5 p.m. on Monday. But we didn't pay attention to the 5 p.m. We thought it was midnight. And the buyer gave us notice at like 4:55. And we didn't check our email. And we gave the seller notice about 6 o'clock, and the seller's agent said, sorry, you missed the deadline. And we did. There's a $25,000 deposit that's being argued over right now. It really sucks, but that's the one instance where it's 5 p.m. We know it's 5 p.m. here. Everything else is basically midnight. Mm-hmm. And wow, I can't believe it's been 2.5 hours. I thought we were gonna get more done than this.
Yeah.
But generally what we do, guys, is Friday is Contract Friday, Master the Contract Friday. Yep. So every Friday morning we get on and we talk about contract issues and stuff. So usually we fall short on addendums. So we'll cover addendums on this Friday. And I think tomorrow for the team huddle in the morning at 8:30, we're gonna do an LOU recap too. So we'll probably get into some more issues on that as a panel, which I think is gonna be kind of fun myself. What do you think, Chris?
I think we covered a lot. I mean, we got all the main items, the main blanks, all the things that you need to really be aware of as far as just protecting your buyers and your sellers in contracts, as far as timelines. All the other things are standards, disclosures, provisions that are in there that you'll eventually start to understand and know, but most of them don't become an issue until they become an issue. So, and that's why you have a partner like us here for you to help you out. So if you have anything that's coming up in a contract, you should always reach out. I don't care if you feel pretty certain with what's going on. We get calls all the time where it's literally, we are outside. We can read the prescription a hell of a lot better from outside the box. So you tell us the situation and we can start trying to put together a plan of attack to understand what's going on. So please feel free, call us with whatever issues you have. We're happy to help. We're happy to walk you through them, and we'll probably give you a different perspective from the outside that might really help. It happens all the time.
I will never make you feel silly. It's always a learning experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what do we have coming up next?
We've got, I just had it up and I've lost my memory already. We have Joe and Kathleen doing Now What? How to service a listing. And then we got Now What? How to serve your buyer with Joe and Otis. So both those will be very interesting.
Awesome. So
And
that's
fun.
going to start at 1 o'clock. We got about 20 minutes between now and then. Get a break, grab a quick bite, and join us back at 1 o'clock. You'll get Joe and Kat telling you once you get a seller, what the heck do I do next?
Yep. Perfect. All right, Chris, thank you very much. Guys, we'll see you back at 1.
Sounds good.